Hi, today we're really going to start driving into what the criteria is for this particular project. We're looking for both Turner and Messer to review the conceptual master plan that was performed in 2006 and 2007 as the basis of their cost estimate that they're preparing. But in addition, there's going to be additional information that's discussed today with each of these topics that you see here in the agenda that we also want taken into consideration when you guys are putting together your cost estimate, because things have changed between 2006 and 2007 and today. So I want to start off by saying that, I mean, the only rule is there's really no rules in terms of the questions that we come up with. We really encourage open participation from all the groups, especially Turner and Messer. We want to make sure that we're all on the same page here with what we're going to be putting together as a cost estimate, because that's really important that these cost estimates kind of are comparing apples to apples when we're reviewing them. So I'm going to turn it over to George now, and he's going to start discussing the preservation zones, and then we're going to go from there. But we're going to really try to stick with this agenda today. I know there's a lot to discuss over a very short period of time. If the time limit comes up and there's still further questions about one of these topics, what we're going to have is we're going to have a breakout room where individuals could go with whoever is leading that discussion to another room to further discuss that topic so we can continue with this agenda. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Okay, there's coffee, as yesterday, there's coffee and tea and drinks in the side room, along with, I think there's a breakfast platter prepared.
I would like to apologize in advance, but our primary mission today is to make sure that we transfer as much information as we can to these guys here. So if I am addressing them most of the time, it's because we need to make sure that what we accomplish over the next 24 hours is to be on the same page and transfer all the information that they need so you can do the pricing. There are two things I want to discuss today, and they have to do with what we call the zones of the building. And they're essentially two different levels of zones that we need to identify. And at the end of this effort, meaning the next few hours, we need to produce two sets of diagrams for you all that delineate two things. Number one is, what are the preservation zones, meaning the significant historic spaces that should be preserved and protected, and where we have flexibility to do a lot of things and make changes and do the uses, put in the uses that the museum needs today and the future, and also produce a tally of the spaces and the breakdown, how much is museum space, how much is storage, how much is conservation space, and so on and so forth. So, yesterday we made one statement that was very simple because the building allows us to do that. And the statement is that when we draw a line on this floor, all of the historic spaces are essentially on this floor above this line. Below this line, we have the big bay, the open areas, where we can do storage, galleries, conservation, working areas, and so on and so forth. Let's summarize very quickly what the preservation zones are and what the spaces are. Number one, coming into the building, the vestibule itself with the awning. They're called character-defining features. And if you look at the historic photographs, you will see that the actual awning was a spectacular piece of architecture. Most of, about 80% of the elements are there. We can go back and recapture them, relight them, and use new technology with LED and so on and so forth, and have a great marquee to get into the building. So the vestibule and the awning is number one. Obviously, the entire rotunda. To the north and the east, the two ramps. On the south side, to the north and the south, actually, on the south side, the areas we're in, meaning these dining areas. This, by the way, was a casual dining area originally, with a series of serpentine counters where the patrons used to sit on stools and have light lunches and dinners. So all these areas here are dining areas. We have about 90% of the historic building fabric. And as you know, we have done the restoration in those areas, so we don't have to touch them again. We need to finish this area, the corridor, the restrooms, and so on. And then on the north side, we need to make sure that we preserve, conserve the director's area and the attached auditorium. Art, did I forget anything? Thank you. And right here at the entrance, I don't know, have you all seen the Newsreel Theater? At some point, if you have not seen it, it is worth seeing and visiting that space. Is a unique place where when the building was open as a railroad station in the 30s and the 40s, you could go in and watch the news actually in newsreel. And about 70–80% of the historic building fabric is in place, and we can very easily recapture it and restore it. Excuse me? And the ice cream parlor on the north side. So now the good thing about all the spaces is that the materials are in place. The worst of all the areas were right here, and we're pretty much done in terms of difficult restoration, because yesterday HDC made the statement that there was a lot of difficult and fine and detailed work that needed to take place. If you walk through the other spaces, you will find that we don't have the conditions we had here, meaning the place was in shambles and needed a significant amount of work. So the degree of difficulty of the restoration of the rest of the spaces is significantly lower than what we encounter here. So preservation zones, essentially this floor. And what we're going to do for you guys is write for every floor and every space what the scope of work is, and so that we can estimate it properly. Now, below that is the open areas. And this is something that I'm going to ask Doug and Art to collaborate and produce a summary that says, here's how many areas we have that are galleries or we need, how many areas we have for conservation, how many areas we have for staging exhibits, how many areas we have for the following functions, and so on. And somewhere in the mix, in the two zones, we need to have one more item added, and that's a calculation that says for so many square feet and so many patrons, occupants in the building, according to the code, we need to have so many fixtures for restrooms. And that will be a basic calculation we will do and have it in place. Do we have any questions so far? We're okay. Are there any questions in the series of questions we received over the last few days that we should discuss in this section? Okay. Okay, thank you. So, if we don't have any questions, what I would like to do is start really the discussion about the mechanical systems. And Greg is going to take over. And I would like to start from the beginning of the discussion, because there have been a series of questions and a series of debates about the mechanical systems. Why do we keep them? Why do we remove them? Why do we do in-kind or not in-kind replacement and so on? So let's start from the beginning.
Thanks, George. So I guess a little background. We heard yesterday that in 1990 a lot of these systems were changed and upgraded in order to accommodate the use of the space in its previous form. And due to budget constraints and availability of funds, we didn't necessarily approach this renovation with the goal that we started with as the designer. So there were some compromises made, and it has served us well. I mean, since 1990, it's 24 years now. Most HVAC systems, as George pointed out yesterday, last between 20 and 30 years. So, the cost savings that we got and the systems that we have in place have done what we've expected them to do. But now as we move forward and we really take this building and look towards the next 50 years, what's our goal? It's really to make sure that the building has a foundation to serve us for the next 50 years for the goals that we have. Conservation areas, the inclusion of artwork, whether it's your artwork or something that you borrow from another institution. And in order to do that, you need reliability of systems, you need redundancy within systems, so this way you can guarantee that you can maintain those conditions. So the way that institutions work when they borrow art is they actually have to show a history of the conditions within a space. They have to show that they've been able to maintain temperature and humidity over a period of time. And they have to convince the people that they're borrowing the art from that they're not going to damage it because of the inability to maintain the conditions within the building. In order to do that, you need systems that are up to the task. So right now when we look at, we'll start with the main central plant. We've got a series of chillers. They're pretty much at capacity now. They're supplemented with an ice storage system, so that this way, for those of you that don't know, so during the day when you're peak cooling load, you use your chillers to maintain your building. At night, it gets a little bit cooler out, so in theory you have extra capacity within your system, and your chillers would normally sit a bit idle. They might run at partial condition. So what we do is we take advantage of utility billing. If you've looked at your home bill, you may see that you pay higher rates during the day and you pay lower rates at night. So what we do as HVAC engineers is we look and we say, okay, our chillers are sitting idle all night. Why not do something with them? So what we do is we run them at night and we produce ice. And we save that ice, we store it thermally, and during the day, during higher utility rates, we utilize the ice that we've made at night at a cheaper rate, and we use it within our building. So we kind of leverage ourselves. So that system itself, however, doesn't save energy. It actually uses a bit more because it's harder to make ice, 32 degrees if you remember science, than it is to just cool a space where we need about 42-degree water. So we use a little bit more energy, but we save some money, playing the market, so to speak. The system that we have now doesn't really work that well. As I said, we're not saving any energy. And as we expand conservation areas within the building, so using it as a museum as opposed to a mall or something else, we need 24-hour conditioning within our spaces. So normally when you have an office space or a space with intermediate occupancy, we're able to shut down those systems, really scale them back, make sure that we're not freezing our space at night, but we're not really trying to maintain conditions. With the conservation areas, we want 24-hour conditioning. We want to maintain those conditions precisely. The artwork doesn't go home, it stays in the space, we have to maintain it. So the use of trying to get spare capacity from a chiller that we were operating during the day and using it at night starts to become a little bit more difficult because now those chillers are needed all the time. The chillers themselves are fairly old. They use an old technology, they use old refrigerant that's being phased out. So part of the idea would be to increase the reliability of that system, put new systems in, they would work more efficiently, and they would be designed such that they utilize different technology approaches to reduce energy, not just to transfer the cost of energy and play the market utility rate game. So right now you don't have what's termed as a waterside economizer. So in conditions where it's cold outside, I don't know what it was here, but in DC it was 0 degrees or so last week. You could use that outside air temperature to produce cold water without using mechanical cooling. So you don't have that operation here right now. So we have old technology, we're at the limit of its capacity, and applying the new program space parameters to that equipment really becomes a disconnect between what we have and what we want to achieve. So putting in new infrastructure in order to maintain our chilled water system and hence produce the availability to control climate conditions in conservation spaces is really paramount in order to get this project to where it needs to be. From an air handling side, we have air handlers that, as we heard yesterday, they serve across different zone types. So where we might have one room that wants conservation conditions because we have a dinosaur exhibit in it, but then next to it we have an office space, we have an air handler that's trying to serve both of those spaces at the same time. It's not really the best approach. You wind up either overcooling one of the spaces or applying a lot of reheat to the air that you've already cooled in order to maintain conditions in one or the other space. So a very inefficient way to approach a building system. The benefit of correctly zoning your air side is that you get tighter control on your spaces, you have more efficient approaches to your energy usage, and you have easier time maintaining those systems because you're not cooling, heating, multiple stages of conditioning of the same exact air. So you have less work that you're doing in areas that don't need it.
Greg?
Yep.
As you talked both of those, the chillers and then the new air handlers, it sounded to me, and maybe I'm just reading into what you said, it sounded to me like for a capital cost, you get a lower operating cost over time.
Yes.
And do you quantify that when you put your proposals together?
We do with a caveat. So,
Is that an asterisk?
It's an asterisk, sure.
Is that like Rodriguez batting records? Or?
So, as an HVAC engineer, what we do is a little bit of reading of the tea leaves, right? So there's a lot of things that we know. We know the efficiency of our equipment. We know how we're going to operate it. Unfortunately, what we don't know is the weather, So what we do is we look at what we would term an average year or, worst case year in the last 100, and we get our weather data from a national source. And we say, okay, that's the weather that we're going to define as the weather that we're using to define our system and its operating. What happens is obviously you don't get that weather, So we can give you a relative cost savings from the system that you have now, which you have the bills for, to the system that we would propose. Whether or not your actual utility bill matches that,
Yeah, sure.
probably
Well,
not.
as long as the assumptions are the same.
Yep.
Based on our current village or the average weather or whatever, at least then we can set up an operating cost reduction model.
Mm-hmm.
Because for this museum, we've got two things. We've got an operating levy that we need to go to the voters for. We've got
Mm-hmm.
a capital levy. If we can show a reduction in operating costs, that becomes a benefit to the capital expenditure.
Yes, exactly. And, the other way to also leverage that is whether or not you intend as the user to expand the amount of conservation space that you currently have. So
Yeah, that's also an important point.
that's also an important part.
Because
So-
that's about enhancing the experience when the
Correct.
person comes here.
Right. But the analysis that we can do can show you all those steps and how they would affect your utility usage.
Good.
So, yeah. So, So we've spoken about big pieces of equipment. We've spoken about chillers. We've spoken about air handlers. You know, the ancillary items, ductwork, piping. You know, piping has, if you look in ASHRAE, as George explained yesterday, it tells you it has a 50-year lifespan. We don't always see that. It depends on the maintenance that's happened within the building, the conditioning of the water that goes through those pipes, and whether or not they're actually scaling and rusting. Over time, they get thinner. But even so, we're pretty much up against what we would expect to be the average life of a system like that. So I can't say that all the pipes are, excuse me, at failure point. You know, larger pipes have thicker walls. They're going to be a bit more robust. We might be able to get more life out of those. But I think for a costing exercise right now that we're trying to go through and understand what our ultimate budget might be, it would be a good approach to assume that, you know, those systems themselves also need to be replaced. Obviously, during the course of construction, we can look and we can see what effect has actually happened when we open up the pipes and take a look inside and see how that material has sustained over time. So, you know, the other benefits that we're going to get to a different approach is really meeting current ASHRAE guidelines, right? So over time, you know, the changes that occur in the code that require different amounts of ventilation air per person, different sound criteria, the quality of the air that we deliver into the space has really progressed through different levels of filtration, different quantities of outside air. If anybody's ever heard the term sick building syndrome, it occurs because we don't get enough ventilation air into the spaces, and the air that we do bring into the spaces isn't really purified and cleaned enough. So with the newer systems that we put in towards the goals that we have to meet our code requirements, these systems all filter the air properly, they condition the air, and they bring in enough ventilation air, so this way we design the spaces to keep fresh air, quality air within the occupied spaces. Along with that, there's obviously an energy cost. The more outside air, if you can imagine, the more outside air that we bring into each space, especially when it's really cold or really hot out, affects how much our operating costs are. So through technology, we're able to measure the amount of CO2 in the space, in essence, knowing how many people are in the space, comparing that to outside, and through building controls, we're able to manage the energy use by reducing the amount of outside air that we bring into the space to make sure it correlates with the occupancy that we have in the building. But when occupancy goes up, that outside air would be able to go up as well and keep in tandem with the requirements of the space. It's kind of hard for me to kind of give a whole overview of mechanical systems in one short talk. But if anybody does have any questions about mechanical systems or what the intention is right now as we would go forward, I'd be happy to answer.
Can you explain what you're looking for as far as the controls and control systems?
Sure. So in large part, you know, as engineers, we are tasked with carrying out the wishes and desires of the client. So we can do what you need us to do to maintain conditions, but we need to understand what that criteria is. So one of the things that we will be doing is working with the museum to understand the amount of temperature control as far as what is the acceptable amount of variation in temperature in both conservation spaces as well as non-conservation spaces, and the amount of humidity control that you want in those spaces as well. For fine art museums, for instance, we might see ourselves trying to maintain a 70-degree temperature, plus or minus 1 degree. In an office space, you would allow that to fluctuate 5 degrees either way and still be fine. So, and there is a balance between that, right? So the tighter the controls that are requested, the more the operating expenses are affected because of the fact that you're continually trying to trim the temperature and humidity within the air that you're delivering to the spaces. So we would work with the museum to understand what that criteria is and at what level they would like us to maintain these spaces. Anybody else? Sure.
If Steve Derheiden is here today, I would like to hear from the museum what the challenges are with the existing systems they have in place and how they're making ends meet. And also what has been the difference since we did the master plan in the last 7, 8 years and the last couple of years since we finished the work.
Ask one other thing, if it's possible. For instance, we have a lot of changing exhibits that come into the facility. There are requirements, say the Vatican exhibit came, it has requirements for the systems. And that's kind of been changing over the years, and it's getting more involved. Jane, would it be possible at some point maybe to pull that information together for the group?
I had some questions on the central plant, specifically the chilled water system, and we know we're short capacity now. What's the expected final capacity of the central plant? And is that a phased expansion? As you know we don't necessarily have all the museum space built out, so would we be buying plant for just what we're building today and leaving it expandable for that future capacity? And then the ice storage, just to compound on what you brought up there a little bit, are we going to replace that system, or are we going to abandon, demolish the ice storage and just stick with a central chilled water plant? What's the long-term thought there?
I'll try to remember all the questions as I go through, but if I forget one, let me know. Not a problem. So I think in the first case, again, we react to the client's needs. So the design team really needs to understand what the goals are of the client, and we can help them understand what they want to do through our responses on or education of technical systems. But I don't think that we have come to a conclusion yet about the amount of overcapacity, redundancy, future space at this time. But right now, I believe we have about 1,200 tons of capacity in the building. And as you said, we're at capacity now. One of the things or several of the things that are going to play into where we wind up has to do with how much of the area in this building we decide needs to be conservation conditions, what the control set points are for those conditions, and whether or not we are allowed to take those conditions and vary them through the season. So some museums approach it such that, let's say for argument's sake, 70 degrees plus or minus 1 degree year-round. Don't want to hear it, it's never changing, right? There are other museums that would allow us to take the 70 degrees in the summer, and as we get to the winter, reduce that to, let's say, 68 degrees. And over a period of 4 months, change the set point from 70 to 68, so this way there's this very gradual resetting of the system components. It doesn't sound like much, and probably most of the energy savings is not because of the temperature, it's really driven on the humidity, but by changing those set points, it really does affect the size of the equipment that we have to put in place and the operating cost of the facility. So until we know really where we're going with all that stuff, it's hard for me to give you a hard answer, but I would expect that the systems would be slightly larger, than we have now. I don't see the building kind of backing off of the areas that they want to have conservation conditions in. If anything, it's going to move forward. And as you said, we're already kind of at capacity, so.
Just for purposes of cost modeling, then, we need to establish some point of reference. So we know we're at capacity at 1,200 tons. Is 1,500 tons at this point? Or do we want to think, long-term that this is a 3,000 ton facility, and parameters need to be established for the model. So that's what I guess I'm trying to help facilitate.
I would imagine that we can take some time after this to throw some ideas and have a discussion and get back.
I think that'd be helpful, and maybe Doug needs to be involved to know which exhibits are going to need that tight tolerance of temperature and which are not, because obviously that's a cost element. I think there's another big block of cost, if I understood the tour and everything correctly and the maps correctly, which is the blue areas that contain mechanical now are potential display areas if mechanical needs to be moved. So the question is, what's the cost of moving mechanical? What's the benefit of picking up that display space? It obviously would affect operating costs because you're going to pick up more space you have to climatize, but there may be a benefit from the experience that's had. So if we could treat that as a discrete block of choice, I think that would be helpful.
Okay.
That probably doesn't help you.
Actually, that was my next question.
Just adds more to your list.
Yeah.
You know, the other item to add into this is that the expectation is to really enhance the efficiency of the building overall.
Right.
So while we will be looking at enhancing the efficiency and operating usage of the mechanical systems itself, we're also going to look at the building envelope. You know, we're going to look to make sure that you know, we reduce the amount of load that we have in the building to begin with. We reduce the amount of loss that we get through the envelope wherever we can. So, you know, there's various things that all play into each other to kind of add up to the solution that we'll ultimately get to.
I think everybody generally understands we need to do that, but we're also under a time constraint, so we just need to establish
So what we'll do, we'll have a discussion with the museum. We'll come up with what we feel is a reasonable estimate as to where we'll be, and then I would assume that you can all use that as the same baseline throughout.
I'm going to speak as a layperson, and you're going to correct me, okay? Bob, you asked a specific question, and I think that question relates to your question yesterday. We have specific locations today with mechanical rooms and a specific distribution of the infrastructure within the building. When we did the master plan 8 years ago, there were certain assumptions that were made in terms of going forward with the future. And one of the issues that the master plan raised was the long-term flexibility of all the exhibit spaces. If we choose to do an in-kind replacement of the systems in the current locations, we're making one fundamental assumption, if I'm not mistaken, that we are accepting the layout of the building in the floors below our feet as it is today, and we're giving up the flexibility for the future. That's one fundamental assumption that we need to discuss whether we want to have it on the table or not. To your point as a layperson, taking out an existing air handling unit, bringing in a new one, and putting in a location is a fixed cost. Whether we're going to put it here or we're going to put it 50 feet further away, it's a relative cost because we still have to do the pads, or we still have to do new connections.
That's really what kind of makes the solution the correct approach, right? Is because you're not just changing the air handler and putting a new air handler and connecting to the existing controls and the existing piping and you're changing all of that. So once you start changing all of the ductwork and the piping, it really doesn't matter if you put it back in the same garage or you put it in your neighbor's garage. It kind of
So, but
I understand that.
Okay.
but you what?
I've been to this movie.
But what you are both asking us is to articulate in such a way so that people can understand.
Yeah, and we can explain it.
Okay. Now, the thing that we need to make clear that between the master plan 7 years ago, whenever that was, and today, are there any new issues that the museum needs to discuss today because conditions have changed? The museum has been faced with challenges in staging special exhibits and shows that came in, and what does it mean? Is the museum giving up specific opportunities because of the system or systems and the way things are laid out? I would say, from what I've heard peripherally, there are significant challenges in terms of getting somebody else's very valuable collection to come here and stage it if you don't meet certain standards. And how short are we of those standards today? And what do we need to do to make up the difference? And that is irrelevant of where the air handlers are. Okay?
I agree with all that. I mean, looking at this schematic, it makes no sense to me to have these mechanical rooms in areas that will be surrounded by areas that need special treatment for the air that goes in them. I mean, what are you going to do? Put up lead walls and all kinds of insulation and so forth? I mean, it just makes no sense. It would make more sense to have the envelope of the building be the border, the perimeter for display, and move the mechanicals somewhere else. I mean, I understand all that. I just think we need to be able to articulate it and articulate the difference, if there is one. You good?
That's okay. You only had 3-question limit, so. Anybody else? Okay, so if I could, I guess, speak to electrical a little bit. So, as of the master plan and some discussions that we've had over the past couple of days, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Didn't hear the assessment of the hot water system and steam system, that capacity.
No, yeah, so the intent would be to keep steam. We need steam. If we are humidifying spaces, it's generally the way that we would deal with that. Also, it's a very good medium for protecting against freeze. So in more northern climates where we get very cold conditions in the winter, it's a great source for preheat coils and making sure that we don't bring the damaging outside air into our air handlers. So yes, the intention would be to keep steam. The boilers themselves are, I believe, original, if not nearly original. They probably operate at an 80 to 85% efficiency rate. That can be improved upon. They also limit the amount of redundancy that we have. So discussions with the museum about redundancy, resiliency, and efficiency will kind of all play into the solution that the design team puts forward. But I think for now what we want to do is we want to assume that those systems would be changed out and replaced. I like the pink. Maybe we can find a way to get the new stuff to be pink as well. So, does that answer your question? Yeah. 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 I think we need a consistent baseline, and from what I understand, the direction is to make sure that that baseline doesn't put us in a position of compromise later. So, if we understand really the fullest extent of where we may be and have the opportunity to back off of that, then we're in a better position than if we assume an optimistic view and then find ourselves needing to exceed that. So, okay. On the electrical side, my understanding from conversations over the last couple of days is that the feeling is that the electrical system that service that comes to the building is adequate.
Greg, I have one more question about the mechanical system. Can you kind of just summarize what was clarification of the existing master plan and what is things that Turner and Messer need to take into consideration as additional information for their cost estimates that they're going to put forward?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that the master plan talked about specific air handlers in different zones. The fact that the air handlers themselves in certain cases may be adequate, although there were several that were short on air we weren't getting enough air change rates into certain areas of the building, which don't allow for proper homogeneity of temperature and humidity control in conservation areas, that there were crossovers between conservation spaces and non-conservation spaces. So I think what I would do based on, I guess, enhancing what the master plan description was to actually, based on the conversations and presentations that we've been doing, is to assume that we're going to replace all the air handlers in the building. And we're going to have an approach that suits the future program space and intent of the facility. The chillers in the master plan were described as at capacity. There were deficiencies described in the ability of the chillers to maintain conditions as conservation areas came online and really took away from the system's ability to make ice at night and then use that ice during the day. Again, as I've described, I believe that we would look at complete replacement of the chiller system. Cooling towers, I think, have exceeded their lifespan. I know that Paul and his team have worked very hard to kind of patch that back together and to keep it running. From this point forward, I don't think that we would try to maintain the existing cooling towers at all. I think those would be replaced. The idea of ice storage would have to be really looked at based on the utility rates that the museum is getting right now. I mean, that's really the only benefit of ice storage is, what can we leverage relative to daytime versus nighttime utility rates. So in the past, there's been big incentives to put in ice storage. So the capital costs associated with installing the system has usually been pretty low. There's been rebates. Whether or not that still exists, in the most part, that they're gone. So I think that there's different ways to approach energy efficiency from that standpoint. Yeah, sure.
Right now, the Museum Center is on a demand ratcheted schedule, which really makes doing an ice storage system going forward financially important for the facility operation-wise. The way that system works is if they go over a certain energy usage, it locks in their rate at a higher rate for a year. So by utilizing ice storage and using a lower demand rate at night, they are able to keep their demand schedule down on an annual basis. So it really helps them leverage their energy rates and keep their operating costs reasonable.
I guess the other one is boilers, right?
You were also talking about the boilers.
Yeah.
And 80 to 85% efficient relative to what we would anticipate with new equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Payback cycles and things like that. Maybe you can explain that just a little bit for.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, there's a couple of different issues, I think, with the boilers. One is redundancy. If we lose a boiler and a boiler goes down, what percentage of capacity do we lose in the building? And, with an office building versus a museum, the rationale for redundancy is very different, So with a museum, it's much more critical, especially when you have traveling exhibits and you have to maintain these conditions. So by replacing the boiler system and approaching it in a way that provides levels of redundancy, I think that makes the entire system more robust and more appropriate for the building type that we have. But in addition to that, we're able to really enhance the efficiency of these systems. So, right now, modern systems use condensing boilers. They're on the order of 92 to 96% efficient. While it doesn't sound like a huge jump, it does make quite a difference in your operating costs.
I think your point about the critical nature of environmental controls that are 24/7
Mm-hmm.
reflection is different than, you leave town for a couple of days, you turn your thermostat on.
You don't have that option, correct. Yeah. You also don't have the option of telling people, the artwork to put on a sweater because the maintenance guy is fixing something right now, and it's going to be about 4 hours before we get everything back online. So, you know. So nobody wants to hear electrical, huh? You just. So electrical. My understanding is that right now the feeling is.
I'm sorry, Greg.
Sure.
You and Steve just talked about another potential operating cost improvement. I'm hoping as we put all of these things together, we'll be able to delineate the operating cost improvements. I mean, right now, I think we have a levy that's a continuation of what, $3 million a year, is it? I mean, if we could save $3 million a year in operating costs and get rid of the operating levy, that would be big news as we're going for capital. So capturing those operating cost improvements is really critical, I think, politically to this process. I'm not an expert in that. I defer to the other members of the task force, but to me that seems critical.
I believe that the incoming electrical service is currently adequate for what we have and is potentially adequate for where we're going. But I think that there is some investigation that needs to be done just to ensure that. And we will know that better once we get, you know, a design that we understand, as the gentleman asked, what our final loads are and what we anticipate as our final loads. But I think for now, again, going back to the thought that we need to capture kind of the bigger picture and then back down from that as opposed to be optimistic and capture something smaller and then worry about where we go whenever we find an error in our thinking. We need to capture something for either addition to the switchgear that we have or even possible replacement of the switchgear that we have. So right now there's 2 substations that feed into a manual transfer switch off-site, and then that feeds into our building. Don't believe that we would be responsible for anything on the utility side. So everything that we would be responsible for would be what comes into our building, goes through our switchgear, and then gets distributed to our secondary systems. On the secondary side, we would be looking to replace the entire infrastructure within the electrical side as we move the air handlers, as we upgrade the chillers. All the electrical systems that feed into those would be replaced and correlated with the new equipment, so this way it's sized properly and feeding the correct voltages and current state-of-the-art systems. So.
Right. One more question. Maybe this is a mechanical and electrical question. Is I know when we're going through design, a lot of times it's very important the offsets from certain things and the space requirements for your mechanical and electrical systems and access. Is there proper access, or is there any additional improvements that need to be made to have that proper access and space requirements that should be taken into consideration while they're preparing the cost estimate?
Yeah, Paul might be better place to answer this, but from what I saw of the switchgear room, it looked adequate. Yeah. Okay. So, any?
Can you comment at all about the emergency generator and your thoughts on the emergency distribution in the building?
Sure. So, thank you. That's a good one. So, emergency generators are put in place so this way, when there's a power failure from the utility company, life safety systems can be maintained. So, by code, they're required to maintain a certain level of lighting within your building, and you need to be able to operate elevators to get people to a safe exiting location. So, there's the baseline threshold of emergency power that can either come from a generator or battery systems. In this case, we have a generator that allows life safety systems to operate and people to be able to exit the building to a safe location in the event of a power failure. When we look at office buildings and those type of venues, that's really the limit to what an emergency power system is required to do. Some tenants might have a small data center or computer system that they want to be maintained as well, but it really stops there. You know, when we look at museums and conservation areas, again, we have this precious artifact that doesn't want to be disrupted, right? Artwork, just a little history or insight, it wants to be maintained at a specific, it's not so much the specific temperature and humidity, it's more the idea that it doesn't want to see change in that, right? So whether it's 68 degrees or 70 degrees isn't really the issue, right? It's whether or not you go from 68 to 70 over a 30-day period or a 3-minute period, you know? And the shock is what causes the degradation of the artwork. So in a power outage, in a place where we have conservation conditions, the real issue that we're trying to insure against is the downtime associated with the systems that maintain those environmental conditions. So again, that would be something that we'd have to discuss with the museum, but I would think that there would be an expansion of the emergency power system to ensure that we're not only feeding the life safety systems within the building, that we're also serving the conservation systems within the building.
Are any of the spaces, the conservation spaces, currently fed by emergency power now? Or is that a whole new system?
Don't know the answer to that.
You got an egress? No.
No? Okay.
Emergency power feeds the fire pumps, elevators, and emergency lighting.
Life safety.
Life safety.
There, that's right.
Don't know where George went.
Does that mean assume an increase?
Yes. Yes. Assume an increase. How much that is, I don't know off the top of my head, but.
We don't have to come up with that right now, but over the course of the next couple of days, I think we do have to make some kind of assumption that 20% of the floor area, I mean, I don't know what it is, but.
Yeah, I think once we understand the areas of conservation, then we can then translate that into the next set of numbers that would be used to determine the pricing on this, but we need that starting point. Do you want me to talk about lighting at all, or do you want to?
I have another question on electrical. So basically, I heard you say that the secondary systems have to be replaced.
Mm-hmm.
So are you talking all the panels within the building, and all the conduit, and just everything, gut and replace?
Yeah, I guess not to that extent. So the power systems that are serving the air handlers and chillers would need to be evaluated and likely replaced. So where we're moving an air handler from one location and now putting it in a different location, that would require obviously redistribution of the electrical system to feed that new location. Where we have 2 chillers and we may be replacing it with 3 chillers, and the efficiency of those chillers is different, the power requirements of those chillers are going to be different. That has to be correlated to the power distribution that's coming to those pieces of equipment. The lighting systems right now are all incandescent. I think the idea moving forward would be to really utilize compact fluorescence or LED wherever possible to reduce the energy usage within the building. So again, we're seeing a very different type of distribution to the lighting systems than we currently have. I would think that would have an impact on the electrical systems that are being used to feed those lighting devices. The power that goes to the outlets, I think we're probably fine. Obviously, we'd have to look and make sure that the cabling and panels that are feeding that are still adequate. But, so I don't know that it's 100% replacement, but it's a fair chunk. Any other questions?
I have a question.
A question for Museum Center is in the historic dining rooms area, a Lutron system was added with various scene type lighting. which is a cost above and beyond your normal electrical. And so a question for the Museum Center staff is, what areas in the building would you like to see a similar system moving forward to add into the cost estimate, so we had specific areas that additional cost could be factored?
In most of the historic areas that we have, I would propose that we consider the same Lutron system or the same capability. The museum needs to tell us, in addition to those areas, are there any other specific zones we need to consider, any special features for lighting? I'm making the assumption that in addition, and this is what the master plan recommended, that in addition to the enhancements inside the building, we need also to include a budget for the exterior lighting. And the exterior lighting has to do with site lighting, safety lighting, and highlighting the building as well. So these items need to be included in the master plan, in the cost estimate. The lighting section of the master plan was extremely detailed and gives quantities, fixtures, locations, and so on. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the lighting designer to revisit it today and see, since the time we issued, the day we issued the master plan, which is 7 years ago, are there any new things we may want to consider that will have an impact on cost? So we will issue to you a supplement and say you want to consider X, Y, Z. Before we say goodbye to mechanical and electrical, I would like to ask one question that has been floating around, and in a way it's a 700-pound gorilla, but nobody's willing to address it. And it has to do with the code, and it has to do with the smoke evacuation system. And we don't know today whether in fact we need or we don't need a smoke evacuation system. And that
This is in the rotunda.
In the rotunda. So what I would like you, Greg, to do is explain what it is and what we have today with Art's help, and then say, all right, is it something we need to have as a potential to be included in the project, and how much does that feature cost?
Right. Okay. So, so a smoke control system is a system in which, when you have a fire in a space, the general approach is that the smoke kills people before they burn. So, off that pleasant topic. So the mechanical systems have to be designed so this way a couple of different things happen. The fire protection systems, that we keep the fire as small as possible. Usually that happens through a sprinkler system. And then we create a mechanism where people are alerted to the fact that there's an event and they can get out of the building. So smoke detection, fire alarms, you hear the alarm, you generally continue to sit at your desk, but hopefully you get up and you leave, right? And the approach to this is such that the evacuation time that's allowed for people from when the event is detected and the alarm is sounded allows them enough time to leave the location where the event is, so this way they can get to safety, okay? The challenges that we have in a space like the rotunda is that sprinkler systems are generally activated a couple of different ways. They're either activated because heat hits the head itself and the sprinkler discharges in the water, obviously reduces the fire load, or it is detected through smoke detection system, which then activates the sprinkler head and does the same. But with a space this high, the problem is that you really don't want the sprinklers kind of located 10 feet above the ground and just kind of floating in space. So they're generally within the structure of the building. They would be so high that the water would have little effect on the fire that was on the floor. So how do we approach this, right? So the challenge to reduce the fire is really difficult because of the fact that we can't reach it with water. So the next step is, well, how do we make sure that at least the smoke is mitigated so this way it's not filling up the space and creating a problem for people? And one approach is to then remove the smoke from the space as it's developed, so this way it doesn't layer and come down into the occupied zone. And the way to do this is through a smoke control system. So Art and his team back in '88 approached this with an approval from the fire marshal, where the east wall of the rotunda has operable windows, and in the event of a fire condition, those operable windows open. The air from the air handling system serving the rotunda go to full outside air to provide ventilation into the space, and the smoke is naturally drawn out of the rotunda through the open windows on the east facade. Okay? Whether we can get approval for that type of approach again, whether it's appropriate for the occupancy and the potential fire load that we would have in the space, all of these things kind of factor into this. So, but with technology today, what we're able to do is we're actually able to model the spaces that we have. So we can generate two different kinds of models. We can generate a model that actually, I think in the past, in 1990, Art explained that he had three barrels of oil that actually lit on fire to create the smoke, so this way they can see what happens, right? We don't do that anymore. So now we use computer technology. We model the smoke virtually, and we can see how operating windows or fans or different devices mitigate the accumulation of smoke into the atrium or rotunda, and what the layering effect of that is, and the time that it takes for that smoke to build and actually reach the occupied space. The other thing that we can model is the egress paths of the occupants within the space. So we can look at the space, we can put it fully occupied, we can have a nice event in there, and again, virtually, we can model how long it would take for people to leave the space. So the hope is that through analyses, we can convince the fire marshal that we've got a space that has, we'd have to agree to a fire load with him. We'd have to agree to the amount of smoke that's developed through that fire load. But we can then technically, through analytical means, show what effect a fire load of that size has in the space, how much smoke is developed. We could also show how quickly or long it takes for people to get out, and see whether or not there's a conflict between those two things. Okay? So that would be the ideal approach, but we don't know if we're there yet. Right? We don't know what the analysis shows. We don't know what the fire marshal's reading on this is. So I think for now we have to assume, again, set that bar to keep ourselves within a comfort level that we may need a smoke control system. So are we able to do that with the passive operation of windows in the east wall of the rotunda? Do we need to add fans somewhere in the space to manually extract the smoke? I would say that for now, as a baseline again, we should assume that we've got fans up there, that we have to manually remove the smoke from the rotunda. We could do that through the double facade of the east wall. We can have the windows open on the inner side and pull the smoke out, through the building and escape it from the building itself. But I think that would set an upper limit as to where that design could theoretically land. And I think the task for the design team to be to reduce that and do something hopefully still appropriate, but with less potential impact to the structure, as well as operating costs for the building. Sure. Oh, they're pretty, yes. Correct. And they're large, right? Right.
Explain to people that haven't really seen the smoke evac system installed, what it makes this building. It's making me nervous.
Not to get too technical about the situation, but the smoke evac systems that we talk about today are because of multiple floors that are atrium spaces that are opening onto multiple floors. The solution that we had in '88 was only because that space, every space in this building was to be a fire suppressed sprinkler system. They realized that that space could not. So they took the idea that if we have warning to people in the building way ahead of time, they would accept that as a way to get out, because those spaces are used, and the entrances and exit ways are direct off of the rotunda. So this is really a fire system issue as far as what is called smoke detection, okay, or smoke evac. When we do smoke evac in other buildings, and we can think about that in this building because we can connect from the lower level all the way up, you know, to the rotunda, to this level, and above the Omnimax, without fire doors, without separations. Well, we chose to do that. So that means the opening, the stair opening that you see in front of the Omnimax that goes down to the library, it actually has a lobby down below that's closed off. Now, do we accept that in the future? I think to some extent, most extent, we do. So as far as a smoke evac system, I think one can argue, depending on how far we want to go with connecting floors, opening floors, we can have that discussion. That's why it's really the fire suppression issue in that large high bay space was the issue. And they've accepted through the existing finishes in the rotunda that there is separation between the rotunda and all the corridors that we traveled through yesterday that are going around the rotunda. So there is really a separation from that space to other floors. So that's how we basically built that argument. I think it's valid today. We've done a lot of smoke evac in other buildings. I think when you start to look at smoke evac because of atrium spaces, that's not exactly the situation here.
And I agree. I think any solution other than that is going to be where you want to head, not just defer, but let's put a smoke evac system in and say we got others.
And that's why Greg's talking about maybe something in there to help that system. But it's really to solve fire suppression issue.
And we have a very big reservoir up there, so.
We do.
Let me connect a couple of dots here. You said it's horrible to have a smoke evacuation system, and I agree with you. And we have been confronted in a number of buildings, and you know, we had places such as the Virginia State Capitol, the Wyoming State Capitol, and so on, where we have these incredible historic rotundas that are open with multiple levels and monumental stairs and so on and so forth. And at the end of the day, some fire marshals say, absolutely not, I'm going to have my smoke evacuation system. And some are more reasonable and have a discussion. And over the years, we've found ways to hide the fans and all the equipment, and you don't see them at all. And there are ways to do that. The reason why I raised the issue has to do with one item. It has nothing to do whether the design team can or cannot figure out ways of dealing with the technical challenges and the architectural challenges or not. My concern is very simple. At the end of the day, I don't want to have a hole in the budget that may be a couple of $1 million, because we made an assumption today that we don't need it. So from the cost risk management point of view, I always advise my clients to say, if this is something that can happen, and Murphy has his way, it will happen. So I want to have a provision for that. That's all I'm saying here. we demonstrated to everybody that the way to do it was without smoke evacuation. And we had the capacity to hold smoke, all that. It was done. At the end of the day, the fire marshal said, I'm going to have my smoke evacuation system, I'm not signing. Now, we are into construction documents. The budget was done without smoke evacuation system, okay? The director of the Department of General Services, the client, self-regulated agency, said, I'm going to put my life on the line here, and I'm going to accept the findings of the report, and I'm going to overrule you. We had that option. So you all know more than I do. All I'm saying is, when at the end of the day, when you do a budget, in the risk management, we want to make sure that we have provisions. People above my pay grade are going to make the decision whether this is included or not. That's all I'm saying.
Guess are we good on mechanical? George, did you want to talk about lighting? Lighting? It's the next on the list, so we covered that. Okay.
There are two big items that are kind of tied together related to the building. Those are fire alarm and security systems. And the big ticket items, there's a lot of small parts, but they're very important to the operations. And most of those systems are rather old. The fire alarm panel has been replaced, but most of the infrastructure still dates back to 1989, 90. Steve, if anything's been replaced and that I don't know of, please chime in. And security, most of the security systems need to be upgraded to current day standards. So, and all those things need to be accounted for in these budget numbers.
Are you going to do anything else as far as like low voltage systems like wireless internet access or interactive? Is that all part of the exhibits, or is there anything you can do in the rotunda, audio visual, or any other low voltage systems?
They currently have a wireless infrastructure in certain parts of the building. As far as whether that'll be part of exhibits, I can't speak to that. Maybe George can.
Thank you. Good question. The entire building is going to have 100% coverage with wireless. And there is wireless right now. The question is whether ultimately we need to have more robust structure in place that will combine regular wireless and wireless that is related to the exhibits. In every museum you go today, you have the capacity to take your iPhone or your gizmo and follow the exhibits, the spaces, and so on. The issue we have with buildings such as this one is that because of the nature of the construction, the amount of concrete and steel you have, you need to have multiple repeaters and boosters throughout the building. So that we need to take that into consideration. I'm going to make the assumption that since we're planning for a building, whether it's a new building or this building, a museum building, in other words, that is going to look into the future, the next 25 years, you want to make sure that you have the capability to stage full range of interactive exhibits. And you need to have the capacity and the infrastructure to do that. So we need to plan and have in place the backbone, the infrastructure to accommodate the new experiences that will come the next 5, 10, 20, 25 years. And the direction is essentially wireless. We The issue that the museum needs to chime in is what other wireless features we need to have in place. And quite a few of them relate to security. We're going to have a security system, typical museum security system for the entire building. But the question we have there is, in the future, do we need to have exhibit-specific security features that cover objects, artifacts, and so on and so forth in the exhibit areas, and what other capabilities we need to have in place? For example, in some of the museums we have done, there are sensors throughout the galleries that if you violate certain barriers, imaginary lines, silent alarms go into effect. So that's one of the things that needs to be thought through. The thing we need to remember is the transmission of signals in buildings such as this one require multiple repeaters. That's all. And for that we can account for. And did I answer your question? Or he left?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. Yes, sir.
So on the security side, is there any major upgrades to the existing security system needed? Or is it adequate and functional and okay, except for the exhibit-specific items you just talked about?
Let's connect a couple of dots here.
Okay.
Okay? There are certain aspects of the security system, the architecture of the security system, that will not change. For example, my primary entrance is and means of egress and doors and so on are going to be the same. Therefore, the reporting points remain the same. The architecture of the building in this area is not going to change. Therefore, it's the same thing. When you go to the galleries, then you need to think about what happens in the future. You need to have a security system that looks into the future. We will probably be replacing cameras and other sensors in certain locations. And that will be a selective process depending on where you are. As you know, the security features and equipment we had 10 years ago in certain locations are Stone Age compared to today. Today we can get a camera that's about the size of this finger that has all the capabilities that a camera this big had 10 years ago. And this will be the case. The question, in my opinion, for a good security system is how you do the layout, your fibers, your connections, and so on, and then you plug and play the pieces. Yes, sir.
It's not easy for me to sit quiet. I'm trying to make sure that this is your discussion, but I'm going to go crazy here based on what I think is some misunderstandings that you could have from hearing this discussion. And so I'm going to pose it a question and put it back to you. But, you know, we spent a lot of time this morning talking about preservation zones and conservation level HVAC control systems and things like that, which are things unique to, you know, being in a National Historic Landmark building, and conservation level HVAC being things that are unique, that are not unique to, but are a part of museum standards. This is a 500,000 square foot building. So out of the 500,000 square feet, by my kind of quick calculations here, if you take out the rotunda consideration, you've got about 16,000 square feet of historic preservation zones in this building. Not that substantial. A lot of it is this space, the internal president's offices, which are across the hallway, not spaces that, as kind of in terms of remaining, are a substantial part of this project. Secondly, if you look at what the archive storage area, what the high-level humidity controls inside this building, it's about 20,000 square feet of archive storage in this building presently, plus a library. And I don't know off the top of my head if libraries on the same climate control. Is it on the same humidity? So it'd be plus the library. So you'd be talking, which is not, so you're probably talking 25,000 square feet out of the whole 500,000 square feet of the building. You also have, in terms of conservation level controls, one of the problems with this building right now is We have conservation level controls in office spaces because they didn't separate the air handling units. So we were actually putting that high level of climate control in offices because as a cost reduction in the original design, they eliminated air handling units so we couldn't get segregation of spaces. So we're injecting this high cost humidity and temperature control into people's offices. Now, if you've got dry skin conditions, we've got a perfect place for you to go to work in the wintertime. But it's a cost we're incurring that we don't need to incur and shouldn't incur, and we'd hope to eliminate in the future. Also, the biggest, in spite of all the discussion around energy and energy issues, our biggest energy consumer is actually electricity. So we've done studies here. The lighting is the biggest part of our electricity cost. So lighting drives more of our electrical costs than does air conditioning for the organization. So those kind of things we out there. My concern is that we're creating an impression that the task force might have that a substantial part of this cost is driven off of the preservation zones, the mechanical systems, as opposed to how much the cost being driven off of, it's a very large building. And it's a 500,000 square foot building with other kinds of issues at play compared to other projects in our community which are much smaller buildings, which is a factor. So I'm concerned with creating, and we're spending a lot of time on things that aren't really what's driving the cost. And I think a lot of the questions that have been asked, we certainly have answers to those, and we have answered those. They've been a part of the plans in the past. Yes, we want to climatize spaces, but we're not going to climatize all the exhibit spaces in all the museums. We can't do that. It would just drive the cost crazy. It would be destructive to the building, and it's not necessary. Science museums, science collections, science types of things don't require climatized environments. So we would be crazy to climatize environments for education exhibits that don't require that. The only thing that has to be climatized is where we have special kinds of condition of artifacts. That's the changing exhibit galleries. When we bring outside exhibits, that's 15,000 square feet. There's one other exhibit gallery we have, which is 5,000 square feet. So I'm just concerned that we're spending a disproportionate conversation. We're going to have the task force here is thinking, well, they want to put everything to these levels, which is going to drive the cost crazy, and that's what's driving the cost. I'm concerned if I'm inaccurate in that, you should correct me, but I want to make sure at least push back on that and don't create a false perception.
I think that's a helpful clarification, Doug, because all of us who aren't museum experts don't know how many of your exhibits are climate controlled or not. And the fact is, from what you just said, most of them are not.
I think that we are in agreement because the last couple of days I've said the number of areas that are historic are minimal compared to the total number, unlike most other national historic landmarks. And we do have essentially two big floor plates that are areas where you put exhibits. And Doug clarified that from that huge number, the areas where require specific museum environments is a relatively small percentage when you compare this museum to traditional art museums, for example.
So the question that you can answer. So George, you've done historic preservation projects around the country. One of the things we want to be able to take advantage of, if at all possible, and we think there's a window, is historic tax credits. Because this cost in this building is not going into, this cost is not exhibits and things of that nature, it's all building related, most of the building would be eligible for historic tax credits to be applied against it. But there are certain historic elements of this building that if we altered them or did things to them that could disqualify this from being eligible for historic tax credits. So it might be helpful for you to explain this. What are the specific elements of this building that if we changed them or we did some damage to them that would actually preclude us taking advantage of historic tax credits, which could be as much as 20% of the total amount. So we're talking about real dollars here.
Thank you. And what is interesting with your question, it relates to the total construction cost. It is not just the cost you spend for preservation zones, for example, okay? That's an important thing that we need to keep in mind. The way we're going to calculate a rehabilitation investment tax credit, that's the official term, is on the total cost qualified expenditures for the entire project, okay? And if you think about it, the areas where you place restrictions are essentially two. One is the exterior building envelope, and two is the historic / preservation zones. And as we've said repeatedly, the preservation zones are less than 20% of the entire building's area. And it's all on this level. And we're not going to change the layout, we're not going to change the uses, we're not going to take the newsreel theater, take it apart, and put in there, let's say, a retail shop. It's going to remain as is. We're not going to take the director's area and demolish it and put in a gallery. It's going to stay a director's area with the spaces and so on. So, to Doug's point, if we continue doing what we have done so far in the building, meaning the exterior building envelope, as we did it, the repairs, the replacement of windows, the roofing details, and all that, the work, the way it was executed, meets the Secretary of the Interior standards. If we start deviating from that, then we're going to be placing the tax credits and put it at risk. We are obligated to do this, meaning this type of work, and meet that standard for one more reason, because the building is a National Historic Landmark, and we're using public funds in the state of Ohio. That's a requirement of the state of Ohio. So, the way we're also treating the exterior of the building, as we said yesterday, we're doing the repairs to last 30 to 50 years. In other words, we're doing all the right things to treat the building correctly, to have the longevity we need for an institutional facility such as this one, meaning the building envelope to last for a very long time, the way you do a museum, regardless of whether it's new or old. We're doing the spaces correctly, and as a percentage of the entire construction, that's a relatively small number compared to the total cost. So when we look at the rest of the building, everything we do, HVAC, electrical, security systems, fire protection, smoke detection, all that goes into the calculation for the tax credits. So every penny we spend in doing the building, it is going to add to the calculation. And the maximum value would be 20% of the qualified expenditures. So you spend 50 million, you have 10 million tax credits. It's as simple as that. And it's for all the expenses, meaning both hard and soft costs. And I cannot, in looking at the building carefully, I cannot find any item, the different line items in the budget, that will be excluded for a simple reason. We really don't have a cost that is normally excluded, and that's called demolition. Meaning, we're not going to be changing the building in such a drastic way by demolishing pieces that will be disqualified. So everything else stays in the calculation. So, Doug, are we together?
throughout the whole building once in a renovation of that size. And not to say that that will be necessary in all spaces, but for cost purposes, it should be considered.
Speak up one more time.
Oh, sorry. For the cost purposes, when pricing out fire alarm security, I think it's safe to assume that a public address system will be necessary in a large number of spaces within the building, especially with a renovation of this size, in order to bring things up to the code. And that's not to say that all spaces in the end will have that, but it should be accounted for just to make sure that that hole is plugged.
In listening to the discussion about the building systems and so on, I'm concerned about two things. And I want to make sure that we're all clear on that. Yesterday, HGC said, we're spending too much money and we're doing all sorts of stuff and detailed work for the envelope and all that. And I don't want people to leave this room with the impression that the cost of the exterior envelope repairs and restoration for this building specifically is significantly higher than any major museum building that we're building today in the United States. In fact, I would argue that on a per square foot basis, new museum buildings in the United States cost more than what we spend for the restoration and repair of the exterior building envelope in this building on Project One. There is always a misconception about a historic building that costs more to rehabilitate. And I'm going to make two arguments against that, because I've been defending and protecting historic buildings for a long time, and the arguments keep coming back regardless of what we say. Number one, it costs more per square foot to do a historic building. Historic buildings are always more expensive. The answer is not necessarily. I cannot compare a vinyl floor with a marble and terrazzo floor and say they're equal. We have materials in this building that have lasted 80 years, and with minimal restoration and repair, we have been able to extend their lives for another 70, 80 years. I'll give you a specific example that I went through in a major project in Philadelphia. We were going to install marble tile floor in a ballroom, a grand ballroom. This is what the owner wanted, as opposed to parquet floor. Different discussion. And the construction manager said, we're going to put thin set tile. And we said, can you explain to us what will happen 10 years from now with a thin set tile? And the construction manager started mumbling. And he was mumbling because the thin set tile is going to start cracking, and we're going to have all sorts of issues. So we said, okay, so you're saying that we need to have a mud set tile with a thick tile, right? So when you compare the cost of A versus B, the labor is essentially the same, which is the highest part of the cost. And for a fractional savings, we're going to compromise the long-term performance of the building. What am I saying about, why am I making this example? Is because when you look at this building specifically, unlike 90% of the historic buildings that have worked, the ratio of historic areas to non-historic areas is extremely unusual. Meaning, we took garages and we made them into usable galleries. The garages have no historic limitations. We can do anything we want. We took really open bays, flexible space, and we made them into museum space with zero limitations. We have a building envelope that allows us to have a building for decades with periodic repairs. And it's an envelope that has tremendous qualities in terms of long-term performance. So, in my opinion, the costs compare much better to new construction. If we were to design galleries today in a new building, we would probably do a similar structural arrangement, head heights and all that, with what you have in this building, in the 2 floors below. And you would have a similar arrangement to allow flexibility for the systems. What we found in the master plan is that there are 2 strikes against the way the museum is organized today. One is there was technology that was used that was based in the 70s and 80s. Doug mentioned lighting. Every single light fixture is incandescent, and the cost is huge in running the building. If you replace all the light fixtures with new technology, LED or compact fluorescent and so on, your costs are going to go significantly lower, and you're going to have better lighting because the technology allows you to do that. The other thing I want to make sure is that we all understand is that in the HVAC discussion, there were decisions that were made in 1988 that essentially locked in the institution in a specific position. And there is no flexibility that allows the institution to operate as a 21st century facility. So I think that if we put these in the right perspective and you analyze what the costs were in Project One, what goes into envelope versus preservation zones and so on, and what goes into museum spaces, I think that this project, this building, compares very favorably to new construction. Every single system we discussed today, smoke detection, sprinkler, voice-activated alarm system, and all that, are the systems we're going to have in any museum that we build today. We're not essentially discussing systems that are special, different, extra, or unusual because of the building. It is the systems we would put in a facility such as this one. Are we all, I mean, I would like to ask Greg, not to put you on the spot, but you have done, I don't know, 30 museums. How would you compare the systems we're discussing here to all the other museums you've done?
Yeah, George is right. You know, the systems that we're talking about putting in here are the same systems that you would put in any modern facility. Not even, you know, to a large extent, not even just museums. Some of the, you know, fire alarm system or other things go in any facility. So, you know, I don't think that you're looking at a premium because of the historic nature of the facility. And as Doug points out, you know, the areas where we've got the specialty systems for conservation are fairly limited as well. So, you know, from that standpoint, I would assume it's a very good investment for your dollar for the building that you're going to have at the end of the day.
So, let me circle back and close the discussion, summarizing some of the points that were raised in the last few hours. There was a question that was asked regarding the in-kind replacement of systems. Why we do not replace systems in kind in the same locations with the same components or types of components, only newer. We discussed the various reasons Why not doing that? And our obligation today is to articulate back what it means to do an in-kind replacement versus what it means not to do it, pros and cons, so that the task force can come to an actual conclusion. The second thing we need to explain is what is the cost of the envelope rehabilitation, what is the life expectancy of that, what it means, and what the limitations are, if there are any, because it's a historic building. And the key issue here is what's the long-term performance of the investment in the rehabilitation. The third thing that we need to clarify and demystify is the amount of historic space we have in the building. There is this confusion that 500,000 square feet of space is historic. It's not. The calculation is very clear. Clearly under 20% of the total square footage. Probably in the range of 50,000 square feet. Makes it about 10%. The thing that is most significant in the discussion that came out today is that, yes, we're going to put in new systems, but we are not humidifying and having museum environment in 500,000 square feet. The number is significantly lower and different, and the message here that we all need to be in agreement on is that these special conditions need to be placed in a strategic way within the building so we can maximize the value. Now, there is an intangible question that was raised yesterday that has to do with the rehabilitation of the building and with any piece of architecture. How does architecture, whether it's new or historic, rehabilitation that is, how can architecture enhance the visitor experience? Because you both asked that question yesterday. How does this project, this investment at the end of the day, will enhance the visitor experience? And we need to be very clear as a design team and as task force and everybody that the investment in the building will enhance in the following ways and list them, the visitor experience. Have I summarized the discussion so far?
You did, George. I thought the one, I know you said this, but I'm going to articulate it differently, is we want to capture any operating, what we think might be any operating cost reductions that come with the capital investment.
Thank you. I'm going to risk the answer here. The basic rule is the following. Every time you replace a piece of technology and equipment with something new, you're going to have a reduction in operating costs. There's no question about it. Now, if we don't change anything in the building, everything remains constant, meaning the way we're using it, how we have the layout, and so on and so forth. And if we just change the technology, you're going to see a very clear overall reduction in operating costs. Now I'm going to ask you to travel with me to Wyoming, where we're doing a project. And we're having the same discussion. We're replacing all the systems. We're doing a major renovation of the building and so on. And the question is, at the end of the day, after we do this, how much money are we going to save for operating expenses? The trouble we have in every project that we do is the following, that the final mix of uses and the intensity of uses will be different than what we have today. So if I have now more exhibit areas, if I have more capability to stage special shows and so on and so forth, my operating expenses may not achieve the maximum efficiencies and savings because I'm going to be using certain areas in more intense ways. So, to your point, we need to say, in the areas that we're not going to change anything, here is the targeted savings. In the other areas, we may have some variances.
It's a separate choice.
Exactly. Exactly.
Actually, a quick question maybe for the staff. I agree with Bob 100%. We need to reduce that levy amount in the operating expense side, but what is our baseline? What are we starting with today? Are we starting with $10 million of operating expenses and we need to go down to 7? What's our point today?
No, the levy is $3 million, but what's the operating expense annually?
It's like for on the building and everything. And some of that doesn't go away. I mean, that's staff, cleaning, maintenance, and things of that nature too. So we're not.
So 3 is a good percentage of the 4.
Yes.
The chances of us really taking out 75% of the operating costs is probably not a great chance.
Right. I got that too.
Just a guess,
Yeah.
a wild guess.
You've been to that movie, right? I was hoping 3 was a smaller percentage.
Right. Maybe we can increase the operating costs really quickly and then drop it back down so we can achieve the 3. Just kidding.
All right, so we're a little bit ahead of schedule. We've gone through preservation zones, use zones, mechanical systems, electrical, lighting, and the remaining buildings. We're going to move into utilities. Is there any questions between now and then on any of the subjects we've covered so far?
How about vertical conveyances, escalators, elevators?
Hey, George, the question was about escalators, elevators, so those types of systems of what improvements need to be made and what needs to be considered for the cost estimate.
If you look at the building carefully, we have less than half dozen elevators for a building that is about 500,000 square feet. That is an unusually low number. And the reason is because your floor plates are fairly large. And you have the ability to move a lot of people very easily from this floor to the galleries below and out of the building. There are essentially 4 elevators that help you move pretty much everything and some freight capability on the back.
George, just to clarify, I don't want to contradict you, but we got 10 total elevators and 4 escalators.
4 escalators, okay. Even the 10, it's an extremely low number, 500,000 square feet. And looking at what is the average occupancy of the building peak?
5,000.
Okay. Try to move 5,000 people with 5 elevators or 10 elevators in a high rise. Ain't gonna happen. So the number is very low, which is good. And they are located in very good locations. The only major change we need to make is in one elevator to be able to go to the 3rd floor, the observation deck on the back of the building. The cabs will have to be modified and refurbished. Controls will have to be updated. Motors will have to be refurbished and updated. But the shafts and the locations are pretty much in the same area where they need to be today and in the future. In every project you do, every 30 years or so, you need to redo your elevators, your elevator equipment. It's not something surprising or something that will break the bank, so to speak. Regarding the escalators, on the other hand, is right now the escalators, not unlike the HVAC system, are placed specifically where the circulation is today. And they relate to the specific layout of the building today. My reaction and response would be, sure, I would like to keep them where they are. But some of these escalators are in the 20-year range, and they're going to have to be refurbished. Should the location of the escalators, on the other hand, drive the layout of the building? And my response is, you want to think about the future the way you think about the rest of the building systems. So I think you're asking the same question as you asked in the HVAC that says, if we keep them where they are, what is the cost of refurbishing them? And what is that we're giving up in the future? If we relocate and put new escalators in the locations where it makes most sense, what is the added cost?
For our time frame, we're going to stay where they are, and we're not relocating.
Okay.
Okay. Can I ask one question? In the long term, we're looking at, there's actually 2 locations where 2 escalators that were never put in. And it seemed to help adding circulation. You talked about this years ago. And that's the 2 main stairs. I can't hear the comment. There's 2 shafts for escalators that were never put in. And they were to facilitate the movement from this level, actually from the mezzanine level down to the lower level for large groups of people coming back out. We did do what we did for the Children's Museum in that lobby down below, but what we were thinking down the road was that those 2 escalators would eventually come in place. That they would actually be developed also. In the 2, right now they're the 2 museums. They're where the stairs are now that people don't really use very much anymore. So, because they use the small elevators that are there to get up, and there's always a backup, and you know that was a cut. We used to use the elevators, or you had to climb those stairs out, and they were in the back. They were kind of in the back part of the museum.
It's more cost effective to redesign the gallery layouts on the lowest levels so that everybody can come around and congregate and come up the escalators that are already in place off the Children's Museum and make that the central gathering point up.
And that's what it is set up today, yes.
And this is about, this project will never happen if we become so aspirational to drive the cost up.
Just pointing it out.
And I'm not for solving every problem my successors might possibly have. I'm going to leave something for them.
They'll be very thankful for that.
Yeah, exactly. My goal is to solve the ones that are silly issues that should be solved. Like, I don't want them to say, well, why in the world would you climatize offices with a high-cost system when that's a waste of money? So I would hope my successors don't look at that. But I have to leave a few challenges for them.
Let them deal with the set of these
They can deal with that.
Okay. So do we have anything else before we talk about utilities? Yes, sir.
Before you move on, I'd like to talk about a couple things that kind of summarize from the mechanical systems down to utilities, where I guess you're going to pick up after this. Philosophically, I just want everybody to know that my mindset, and so is the mindset of my maintenance staff, we are trained and taught, and I guess I'm old school, so I'll bring this up first. I was always taught to repair things and not replace things. Anybody can be a parts changer, and you can take care of replacing a lot of things real quick and running cost up. But in our world, we don't have the money to always change parts. So the conditions have always been, with all of our equipment, wherever we can, to make those repairs, to fix things, to keep things running, to put that Band-Aid on it in the best possible way to keep those costs down. So a lot of the equipment that we're talking about here in the building has reached its useful life. You've heard the stories. We've put Band-Aids after Band-Aids after Band-Aids on things to try to keep them moving. Our 2 chillers, our 2 centrifugal chillers, one of them has had some major repairs in the past 5 years, twice actually. Not inexpensive repairs. We're talking $50,000 to $60,000 worth of repair. That's internal repairs. Now, as those parts get replaced or repaired during those periods, there's other things that happen, whether it's opening up the system so that now air can get into the system, and there might be leaks. And as that air gets into a refrigeration system like that, it creates other issues. So chillers, to my best of estimates on all the repairs that we've made to them, they're reaching beyond their useful life. We can't keep putting Band-Aids on things to make them keep going, but they're moving along. The boilers, the 2 hot water boilers are in terrible shape. Every year we have one of them, we open them up every year, and we do everything we can for preventive maintenance, but again, they're getting to a point where we can't even get parts for them. The term obsolete, even though it's there and it's operating, when we go back to the manufacturers or the people that are going to be able to work on them or help us with them, they tell us they don't make parts for those things anymore. So now we're strapped with, well, how do we get the boiler that we're used to putting pieces and parts on? We can't even get parts for them anymore. We've got a boiler right now that's down. It's one of the 2 big hot water boilers. We have been in touch with Cleaver Brooks to see if we can find a ring that we need on the inside. We're still waiting. We've been waiting for about a week and a half now to get those answers. We can't get answers because they don't make those boilers anymore. So it's a struggle. Last year we had a boiler stack that was in bad shape that had to be replaced. Part of it had to be replaced just due to deterioration. That was a $60,000 repair. All these little improvements that we're making that spend a lot of money cost-wise aren't gaining us anything in return of being able to operate equipment more efficiently or use things that are going to help us to keep our operating costs down. The energy management system that we have is, again, obsolete. It was installed in 1990. We have had some upgrades to it, but there's several components and several remote panels around this building that are tied to that system that, again, are obsolete. We can't get parts for them. And the communication of making sure that all these systems are talking to one another, there's problems with that. So in turn, we can't operate the building efficiently. The lighting that Paul touched on earlier and the lighting control and how much control we'd like to have. Our means of turning lights on and off in this building are to send a person or more than one person around the building each day at the beginning of the day, usually a couple hours before we open, to start turning the lights on. And it's not a simple matter of going to your rooms and turning a light switch, because if you look in this room, there are no light switches. Usually it's going into an electric room and turning everything on by breaker. The breakers get turned on in the morning a couple hours before we open. The breakers get turned off after we close. But it's all very time consuming, and there's lighting that's on much longer than it probably needs to be on. We could be more energy efficient, as Doug was talking about how one of our biggest expenses is our utility cost for lighting. We don't control the lighting through a centralized computer. There's isolated areas like Paul just talked about, the Lutron system that's upstairs. But that's few and far between the rest of the museum and this other 500,000 square feet facility that we have to turn things on and off manually. So it makes it very difficult for us to be efficient with our utilities if we have to have lights on way before and way after we close. So centralizing that on a computerized system would certainly help. The other thing is humidifiers. We have a lot of remote humidifiers that feed the galleries. They've been in place for a long time and they've reached their useful life. When we go to look for parts for them, we find out that it's obsolete. You can't fix this or get this board, so what are you going to do? So you're robbing off of another system that may be in another gallery that's got the same vintage equipment, but you're not using that gallery, so you take a part off of that and put it over here to get this one working so that you can make sure your artifacts are protected while you've got this exhibit going on. We've got this exact problem right now in the big changing exhibit hall. When we had the exhibit, the Dead Sea Scrolls, we had a difficult time maintaining temperature and humidity in there. And this system, as it always is with Murphy's Law, in the middle of the run of this exhibit, we had a problem and the humidifier went down. And the only way we could get it operating is to go take parts off of another humidifier that wasn't in use at the time because that gallery it wasn't nothing in it, to get it running. Those are the kinds of things we're faced with on a daily basis around here. I'm not crying wolf. I'm not crying that we don't take care. We try to take care of things around here the best we can with what we have. But the way we do it is very judicious, and we try to use money wisely to take care of things where we can. But I'm reaching out to tell you that there's a lot of things that are failing that we just can't keep putting those Band-Aids on. And ultimately, they tie right into utilities, which can cost a lot of money if you're not doing things the right way.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. In looking at, I was reminded that in looking at some travel arrangements and obligations, we need to shift a couple of things around. And what I would like to go next, to discuss next, is the structural issues and the building envelope. And I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about structure.
Okay, so structurally, there's kind of two completely contradictory messages that I want to make sure you come away with. One of them, I think you've been hearing a lot about, the corroded steel that we have in the building, the lintels that are corroding. If you stopped by on your tour and you noticed the case down in the exhibition where it had some of the steel that was pulled out during our Project One, that's some pretty serious corrosion. As we walked around the site yesterday, we saw some masonry that was corroding. I could sit there and I could just see the lintels where I see the corrosion poking through. In Project One, we did some investigation and we did some repairs so we have an understanding of what's happening. This corrosion is due to water infiltration. So we have something that is pretty serious and it needs to be addressed. However, it is a local condition. It is a condition that's relating to your parapets. It's a condition relating to your lintels at your upper floors. It's a condition relating to a portion of the building. On the other side of the structure, you have an amazing amount of steel that is in a great condition. And you have an amazing amount of steel that is perfectly suited for what you need it to do. It's designed for high load capacity, for what you need in the museum. It has performed well over the last 80 years. So I think it's important when we talk about the structure, we remember we're talking a lot about local conditions. We're not talking a lot about global conditions. We don't have any conditions where we feel there's some major structural condition. So with that in mind, so remember we've got the bad news that yes, you have a problem, but we have the good news that you have a pretty good structure in this building. So with this building, we have two advantages structurally. We have the building. We have a building that is telling us what is going on. Because of the construction method, which nowadays nobody would do of as far as building masonry and concrete completely tight to the steel in this manner where you have it packed together. We were in a construction method where they really hadn't fully embraced the steel frame with the cavity wall approach. They were still kind of hanging on to the bearing wall approach. So we sort of have this combined system where we have this exterior masonry wall that is acting as your barrier system. It's keeping your elements out. It's keeping your water out. It's keeping the temperatures. It's addressing the envelope of the building. You have the steel, which is doing the primary structural work. So because of that relationship to it, if there's going to be cracks, if there's going to be problems, if there's going to be major offsets in the structure, the building is going to tell us about it. We're going to see what's going on in the masonry and in the concrete. And so again, the places where we see problems generally relate to where we have water infiltration. There's a couple of exceptions to that. And those, let me talk about first about the other advantage we have on this building. We have the original structural documents. We have a lot of original photos. We have a lot of information. There are certain unknowns in this building, but we've got a pretty good heads up that I can look back at the structural drawings and understand these trusses. And one of the things that those structural drawings tell us is about how the trusses were constructed and about how the thrusts are resolved. During the walkthrough, there was some conversation about the cracking on the exterior wall around the dome. There's a great pattern of X's. I'm sure everybody saw it. Okay, maybe not everybody saw it, but it was absolutely a wonderful pattern of seeing these crosses of cracking that probably relate to where the trusses are framing in. Looking back at the original structural documents, there's a discussion and a criteria of how they were counting on the north side being constructed and it being tied and secured to the framing on that side, and it was to allow for a certain amount of deflection on the south before the south side was installed. So from those documents, we have some ideas and some insights to how they expected this truss system to move. So it informs that what we probably are seeing along those walls is something that's related to the truss. It's local. It might be due to temperature. It might be due to when they were doing the roof project and they changed the loads on it and they had some additional loads and the loads spread. So there's a couple of areas like that where we're going to need to pay some additional attention to. But again, it's local. We're talking about stuff that's around the base of the domes where we have the walls that attach. Again, the building is telling us what's going on because of the water infiltration as well as because of the crack patterns. So structurally, I think that we look at what are the risks to the building with it. One of the risks to buildings is the loads, is the people. The way this building was designed, it can support whatever use you want to use it for, and we're not changing any use. You have the loads of snow, you have the temporary loads of that. You also have the load of thermal. So we have a fairly large structure with steel and with masonry, and things with temperature expand and contract. So again, what we're going to be seeing in some of this cracking and some of this pattern is the fact of how the building has been responding to temperature over the last 80 years. The building is telling us how it has been moving, where it has relieved, and we need to listen to that. So when we look at the repairs, we need to look to address the conditions that we're seeing, that where the water is infiltrating. We need to solve that problem. Corrosion is an exponential process. It is not something that goes along and is at a constant rate. It goes exponentially. The corroded lintel that we saw out there was not there in 2009, showed up in 2011, and in its current condition, they need to do something about that immediately. That is a risk of bricks coming loose. From what I haven't done an assessment of the full building during this trip, but that's one location. We can probably find another 5, 6, or a dozen locations that might fall on a critical list. But again, we're talking about isolated conditions. So structurally, we have the building, we have the original documents. However, there's one thing that we really don't know a whole lot about right now, and that's the foundation of the building. The understanding is that it was built on wood piles. We know that this is a site that has a lot of fill on it. We know that throughout the building, there's a settlement of slabs. A lot of these slabs are independent of the main structure. So you have that the main structural systems may not be moving and they're supported on the piles, but with this fill that you're seeing, there's some movement in the slabs. So we know that there is some unknown condition about what's going on with the soils. I don't believe a geotechnical investigation has ever been done on this site. And now would probably be a good time to do it, to understand what is this fill, what are the different conditions you have around the site. So before you go in to fix some of these slabs, you understand what the conditions are. Now, understanding the piles is a little bit more of a challenge because we can't see them. I can tell you that from what I've seen around the building so far, and from what I've seen where wood pilings are significantly deteriorating, the buildings tear themselves apart, and they continue to tear themselves apart. On one structure out at the Brooklyn Navy Yard where we had a significant change in the water level. So we had timber piles that had originally been submerged. Timber piles that are in water are perfectly happy. The problem becomes when you get the fluctuation, and you get the wetting and the drying of it. And we had some significant settlement on the corner of the house back in 2000. It had been shored. Beautiful job of shoring. It moved again, and that shoring was no longer engaged, so they reshored it, and it moved again. So again, it was a matter of the building was definitely telling us what was going on. So far globally around this building, I don't know that we're seeing any signs that are like that. We are seeing more local signs of what's happening with the fill. Now, verifying what the condition of the piles are can sometimes be a lot more challenging, because basically right now, the way you have to do it is you have to see it. So that means going in, exposing, doing some probes in order to verify what the conditions are. Once we have something exposed, then we can get all sorts of great technology. Some impact echo is a sounding technique that can tell us how deep the piles are. There's probing to verify the condition of the wood. So there are certainly ways to better understand the foundation system. But again, right now what we're seeing is we're not seeing it's tearing itself apart, but I know yesterday we had several conversations about what is the system and do we need to understand it better. So we've hit on the local structural issues.
Can I ask a question? Why wood piles if there's so much steel in this building? It just seems strange. Are we trying to be like Venice or something? Or why did they do that?
Maybe they had delusions of Venice. I like that idea. Wood piles were a fairly common construction technique as far as
drilling through.
Even with all this steel. Yeah. And I was asking some of my colleagues as far as if they knew what else was in piles around here. I mean, the other part you got to remember is you got train engineers building this building. What do train engineers do? They're building bridges. We got a bridge here. That's what these trusses are. You have abutments that are coming off of it. There's so many parallels of this structure. Let's say that you just architecturally stripped all of this finish off. You would have a beautiful exposed bridge structure with it. Not that we're going to do that. And so wood piles was definitely a part of construction then, and it may have been because of the fill and then wanting to get down to the structure, or I'm sorry, down to the good bearing. That's one thing where a geotechnical report could help us understand if the piles are friction piles, which mean they just rely on being confined and contained in the ground, or if they're bearing and they go down to a substrate that can support it with it. So a lot of times what you'll see is two things happening. Is you would either see the building settling in its entirety. The load of this building is itself. The dead load of this massive structure is the biggest load that will ever be on this building, regardless of how many people you get into the rotunda or regardless of how many people you get into the museum. So one thing that can happen is if you get something that is sort of a global settlement. Again, I don't know that we're seeing signs of that. You can get local settlement where you're seeing that you may have a cluster of piles that are having a problem with it. I don't know that we're seeing that, but I think that that's where in the design phase, be looking closely at some of the cracks that are around the building.
Nancy, can I speak just
yes.
a bit? In '88, we did a couple geotechnical investigations. One was where the old Tressler Comet Station was, because we wanted to know if there was any leading of those old tanks. And we went down, we actually felt it was pretty solid at that point, but we also had a problem in the boiler room where the floor collapsed under a boiler because of the dropping of the fill material. In that case, we were able then to look at the pile caps a bit, and in that location it's pretty amazing that those wood piles, at least in that location, and we're suggesting that we look beyond this, but in that location they looked like they were put in the day before. It was pretty amazing. That technology was used for many, many, many years, and it's holding up in many buildings right now. So.
Yeah, and you're talking about older growth lumber. You have a advantage of having much better timbers. So I just want to reiterate, that's something that's an unknown. We just don't know that. I don't know the condition of that. Am I seeing anything that is a huge red flag where I'm going to say at this point in time you need to assume you have to reinforce the foundation? No. Do I think it needs to be investigated? Yes. Do I think there needs to be an account for addressing these slabs that are settling? Yeah. You've got about three inches of more settlement in some of these slabs. So that's going to involve addressing the soil either by some sort of injection method or by coming in and readdressing the soil and putting in a new slab. But again, I think that those are a lot of local areas, but it's local. So I think I want to go back for a moment briefly about the corrosion. I think I mentioned that it is an exponential process.
Can I interrupt before?
Yeah.
I apologize, but how did these guys, when they're putting their budgets together over the next week or so, how do they budget for a geotechnical unknown that could take a while?
Well, I think that the unknown at this point in time needs to be treated for a confirmation that there isn't a problem.
So did we assume that there's no problem?
That's what I would do with this approach. And I think that we'd be interested in seeing what the peer reviewers may also come back with. But I think that, again, based on the fact that we're not seeing something global and overall, except for at the slabs with it.
So these folks just budget as if it's fine, and
yes,
we'll find out during due diligence whether it is or it is not.
Yes. Yes. And if it is not, there are ways to solve it. But again, that's where we need a geotechnical report in order to understand it. If I was seeing different conditions around the building, I'd be giving a very different answer. I'd be saying, yes, we need to budget and assume you're going to have to put micropiles all around the building. With those micropiles, we're going to re-engage the pile cap. We've done that before, too.
I know you can't be assured of this, but the likelihood of an 80-year-old structure, if it's in the condition that it is from a settling standpoint, the likelihood that there's a major problem that a geotechnical is going to discover is?
Very low. So the question was as far as what is the likelihood, and I say very low. I think that there is the due diligence of you're about to put in X millions, hundreds of $1 million into the building. Let's check it out. So anything else on the foundations? Okay. So going back to what we do know, which is the corrosion that we're seeing around the building. On a lot of projects of significance, I'm bringing on a corrosion engineer fairly early on in our investigation. What this corrosion engineer is able to do by going in and taking various measurements and readings and doing some life cycle costings, we can get an approximation of how long a facility needs to plan for doing improvements. So we just did a study for a building where we were able to say, you probably have about another 10 years of life on parts of your building, you have another 100 years of life on other parts of your building. I don't need to bring that corrosion engineer in here. You have elements of this building that structurally are beyond their useful life in those lintels, and that corrosion needs to be addressed. I don't feel like there's any reason to do any study for trying to understand how long you have to further maintain these things. Now is the time that you need to look to make these repairs, because it's gotten to the point where if you look at from what our observations were to, I was just handed a report from 2011, and then from what we've recently seen, we're definitely on the exponentially increasing portion of the corrosion of the steel in those local areas. Again, because of how the construction is, the building is highlighting us and telling us where those local areas were. On the project one, we found that there definitely was, the corrosion was by far the worst higher up in the building, where we had more water infiltration and where the cracks were opening and you got air. So you got to have air and water to get corrosion. And with corrosion, it expands at 8 to 10 times. So if you have an 1/8 of an inch of loss of structural steel, you have 8 inches of pack rust. So you can have very minimal loss of steel, and you can have enough corrosion to start to break the masonry. The masonry does not like these expanding forces. The joints will open and the bricks will crack. So again, our structure is at least telling us what is going on, and it's telling us where it needs help and where it needs assistance. And because of the system, that's where we get into the challenges that they presented during the construction talk yesterday, the challenges of getting in the appropriate waterproofing and rebuilding these parapets and getting in the protection of the steel. Getting this steel protected and getting this envelope enclosed is very important for, of course, maintaining the environment of the museum, but also you have some elements where there are bricks that could fall off of the building. You need to address the corroding lintel in that one area. And we need to catch the rest of these problems before they progress to a period to a position where when you're looking at the outside of the building, you have concerns about where the public are moving. Is that tomorrow? No. Is that next year? Probably not. But it's something that you need to keep in mind when we're looking at addressing this. This is something that right now is definitely going on an exponential progress up and needs to be addressed. So is there anything about corrosion of steel or lintels? Yeah.
Question. So it sounds like inevitably this condition is going to occur at all the lintels unless they're the packed construction is unpacked. Are you advocating that all of them are done now, or what do you do with the ones that are not exhibiting significant corrosion at this point, but ultimately will?
I think that because of it's known of the condition and what's going to happen, unless there's something that is done that it is very apparent that that lintel has not corroded, they should all be addressed with it. And from what I walked around, if you look at the upper band, we're talking about the upper band of lintels. We're not talking about the full lintels for the project. When you walk around that upper band and you look, and you'll just start to see this little bit of gap and this little bit of blooming, and then usually you'll also see caulk smeared all across it. And then you see this caulk that's keeping in more water, so then the caulk breaks, and then you get more corrosion with it. Yes?
The master plan defines, where it's been localized pretty well, so I think we understand. It seems to be one of those cases where it would make more sense because we know it is worse than what is shown on the master plan. We do include some greater assessment or allowance for repairs. Some things you don't know, just like the pop, you don't know, you don't have indications of problems, so why have money? You know you have indications you've got a bigger problem than you have. Certainly from our past visits, while we were doing some of the next ones, that we can see that it's a lot worse than what it is. That's just one comment in regards to allowing some additional costs for repair of masonry, repairs beyond what's shown on the master plan. To the extent that it's possible, and I don't know that, this is a big question for the community in general, but it's in regards to how do you accelerate the project, assuming that the levy would pass, the operating levy, then the capital levy that is would pass. You're going to want to start construction sooner rather than saying, okay, now that the capital campaign is passed, now let's start designing a year and a half from then, and then we can start construction. You're just that much farther along an exponential path. It's very hard to recover from. So there would be, recommendation that you can at least accelerate design or make some provisions for paying for design in the front, so that when, assuming that an operator or capital campaign passes, they can move more quickly into construction.
Yeah, I would never argue accelerated design fees. But I think that that is a very good point of as far as the approach of focusing on what is the known quantity. And it's been known for a long time. We're not dealing with something that's a surprise here as far as what's going on with these walls. So that would certainly be one approach, would be to accelerate that design so that it's understood, so that it could be done. I don't know if George has anything of as far as the overall approach and breaking it out, but of course he has an issue.
The construction documents we put together in Project One. If you listen to what Nancy just said, the vast majority of the issues are above the top row of the windows. If you look below, the corrosion and the problems in the rows of windows below the top row is significantly diminished, in some cases zero. One of the things that we found in analyzing the problem is that there is no protection and through the wall flashing that essentially protects the masonry system and the lintels, and the water goes straight through. And we developed a detail in Project One that allows you to protect the building in those areas. If you do just that part of the work without doing simultaneously the roofs, you're not achieving maximum efficiencies and economies of scale. and you're adding cost to the project by staging it into pieces. If you do the roofs out of sequence, you need to ask yourself the question as to whether I have an additional risk. And the risk is the following: by the time you finish all of your design elements and decisions, restrooms, penetrations through the roofs, vents, and so on and so forth, in the span that you're going to do the exterior roof repairs or replacement and the parapet, and you come back a year later, you're going to be penetrating through a roof that just got its warranty. Can I finish? May I finish, please? Thank you. So, what we have discussed in the past on this project is we need to identify, are there any areas that are urgent? And Nancy, over the last 2 days, because it was the first opportunity we had, the two of us, to be on the building again after a couple of years, brought to my attention and to the rest of the design team that since our last visit, there were a couple of areas that have gone exactly like this. So the question that we need to ask is the following. Actually, there are a couple of questions we need to ask ourselves. Question number one is, what is the window we have before we need to intervene to manage risk? And in the areas that Nancy identified, I'm 100% in agreement that we need to do this now, with one follow-up question. Do we take that part of the building apart and put it back together, or do we do temporary shoring and protection? Because in every single of these areas that we're talking about, in each lintel, you're attaching a window. So, do I do the repairs to the lintels without replacing the window, or do I do it as a package? So if you go through the sequence of construction of what we did in Project 1, you may find, because of the way the pieces are together like this, you may have to do it as a single package for the entire building envelope. Means and method, sequence of construction, and so on is your expertise. We're going to rely on you, on the experts in construction. But what we found in Project 1 is that if you try to decouple certain things, you may be paying penalties, and you may have some additional risk. But what I learned in the last 48 hours is that there are 4 or 5 areas we need to deal with and address the risk today. It does not mean necessarily we have to take it apart and put it back together. It means manage the risk now.
From a point of view of quantities on Project 1, we found that we replaced everything at the top level where the parapet is, all the lintels. The next level, mezzanine level, we had maybe 3. And at the lower level, we didn't replace any. So it's kind of, yes, we worked with the allowance issue, all of those types of things, but what we did find is pretty much what we thought was going to happen is most of the integration with the parapet was where we had to replace lintels.
So I think that for the costing, it's going to be, you should pretty much assume you're going to be touching every parapet with it. And generally, they're going to be going back according to the concept of what we did in phase 1. I think that there is one exception to that, and I think that that is the wall that's on the back sides of the dome, where we have the cross cracking. I think in that case, we need to little better understand what is happening. Is that a condition of some movement of the trusses that maybe is fully understandable, and it's what the building's been doing for 80 years, and we want it to keep it doing. So maybe we want to make some adjustments to how that wall is designed and built to give the structure some more room for that. So I think that there will be some premium for the redesign of the walls right on the back side of the dome. It could, I'd be very surprised, it could be that you get in there and what you see is actually at some local place that it's just, this is where the truss is touching it and this is where there's been corrosion. And so what you're seeing is some isolated rest jacking. I've just never seen it quite present that type of cracking pattern. But either way, I think that those two segments of the walls are going to be a little bit more of a special case for the reconstruction of those.
Question?
Yes.
And I apologize for asking such a specific question, but on the parapets that were reconstructed, did we end up going back in with a metal cap, or did we replace the original cap that was there at the top?
The original cap went back. It did not go to a metal cap across there.
It was the original cap because it's a National Historic Landmark, and we're working with the National Park Service and the State Historic Preservation Office. We were really obligated to put things back the way they were. That being said, we improved the flashing greatly, and that there's now through-wall flashing beneath that cap, and the roof membrane comes up and meets that flashing on the backside, and so it's a much better condition than existed there before. Any chance of a variance for that going forth?
Variance to do what?
The question, we have a terracotta cap on top of the parapet, and it's made up of individual terracotta pieces that are about 8 inches long and 6 inches wide.
If you look at the detail that was developed and then through the wall flashing, the only difference between a cap at the top and what we have done is essentially a couple of rows of bricks. What we want to do is achieve the requirement of the Park Service and the landmark designation, and have our cake and eaten too by having the right detail so that the moisture would not penetrate through. In other words, protect the structural members. Any chance to get a variance, meaning asking the folks who are going to give us the approvals for the project, we are always willing to put this on the table to have a discussion. On the other hand, the museum and the county and the folks who are going to put up the money are going to have to make a decision as to whether they want to put in jeopardy $20 million, $10 million in tax credits when the Park Service says, we're not going to approve that detail. That's, in the risk management side of it, what we endeavor to do is manage the risk by putting through the wall flashing and improving on all the details and make sure that we have a tub essentially that prevent any water from going through. To put the metal cap on top, which is normally my preferred detail when I do parapets, and put something else at risk, it's a decision that somebody else is going to have to make.
So we've talked about the lintels. The other part of steel that we have going up by the parapets is the spandrel beams. So underneath the parapet, we have the slab that comes across, and then there's a spandrel beam across there. As a part of the Project One, we had called for scrape and paint and potentially reinforcing of this spandrel beam. I believe that there ended up being no reinforcing of the steel. It was just a matter of getting in, scraping the steel, putting on an appropriate coating so that it's protected against future corrosion. And then I think there was only 1 or 2 local places where we did some reinforcing. It was typically more around connections where there was some corrosion that was related to connections or related to the very ends of the beams. So I think that there needs to be an account before where you're dealing with the parapets. You're also going to be dealing with the spandrel beam across there. You're going to need to be scraping, painting, and treating that. Then we get to the columns. So we have locations at the columns where we see all sorts of wonderful cracking coming off it. Well, I guess to me it's wonderful cracking, but not to most people. It just tells me what it's doing. So again, we see that because we have the corrosion at the top of the columns. In Project One, one of the things we see that the cracking goes all of the way down. And there's even some cracking through the concrete in the base. So yesterday they were talking about exposing a column full height. Part of what we needed to do is we wanted to see that to be able to understand, you know, we saw what the cracks were before, we saw what the steel was, And that allows us to then interpolate as far as what may be going on in other areas and how far extensive it needs to be. The columns that were exposed in phase 1, again, the corrosion was mainly at the top. So we're coming down the column, the top several feet, had some pretty good rust jacking and some expansion. As you went down the column, it got less. I believe that once we got below the floor, there wasn't anything going on with the columns. Once we got down to the base of the concrete, there really wasn't any corrosion going on to the concrete, and a lot of the cracking that we were seeing in the concrete apron that around the building typically corresponded to reinforcing that didn't have adequate cover, and so it was better to just leave it than to do anything about it. So that was very, very informative of as far as being able to say, you need to assume every column you're having to take from the ground up and deal with. I think in reality, there's going to be a couple cases where you probably have to go a little bit lower, but generally it's going to be from the floor up that the columns are going to be exposed, scraped and painted, cleaned, same type of process. So we've talked about the steel, so then we need to talk about the concrete. So on our tour, I mentioned that one of the things that we have with this building is we have a draped mesh concrete slab system with cinder concrete. So basically what that means is you don't have rebar. We don't have rebar, which is what you would see in modern construction. You typically have a thinner wire, which is a draped mesh, which acts as a catenary across the structural system. And it goes from beam to beam with it. And then the concrete itself is something that has cinder in it, they used it a lot in early fireproofing, a byproduct of the coal process. And generally, as long as cinder concrete and draped mesh slabs are dry and interior, not a problem. As soon as you start to get a cinder concrete slab exposed to a lot of moisture, you can see significant deterioration. And we saw some of that on the tour. If you looked up in some of the places around by where the joint is, you would see concrete that had spalled off. You'd see the bottoms of steel beams had lost their encasement. You'd see that there was some places where actually the mesh had fully corroded through. Again, we're talking about a local condition, and we're talking about where there's been significant water infiltration. Again, the building is telling us what's going on. We need to stop that water, and we need to repair that concrete. Draped mesh slabs are absolutely wonderful, but once you start to lose the reinforcing that is in there, you need to come in and reinforce it. So in the areas where we have that condition, we're going to need to look to come in and put in some supplemental steel and either some beams and potentially they're coming back with some metal deck, depending upon the condition, possibly even locally replacing the slab. That's primarily going to be in the areas where there's significant water infiltration along the expansion joints. There may be some local areas around the roof. I personally didn't spot anything yesterday, but I didn't get everywhere yesterday. But there will definitely be unknowns as we go through the process and you go through the work. There's going to be some places, but generally it's in good condition. We did a variety of cores and testing. We have this process called petrography, where they take a core of the concrete, and they polish it up, and they look at it, and they can tell us various properties about it. So we took a variety of cores on some roofs where we were working in Project 1, as well as some on one of the ramps. And from the testing, one of the things we're looking for is what's called the level of carbonation. We want to protect our steel. We don't want our steel to start to corrode. And when your carbonation level gets to your reinforcing, that's where you start to have a problem. So we do this testing to understand how protected is the steel. Again, we want it to be dry and we want it to be protected. And so the testing that we did revealed that from the tops of the roofs where we did the cores, the water infiltration had not started to cause problems with the cinder concrete. So the depth of carbonation was very low, very at the top of it, and it had not gotten to the reinforcing. What we did find on the ramps was one of the things that was very interesting was we actually found the depth of carbonation was more on the bottom. That didn't make any sense. We always see it from the top down because of the water infiltrating. It had to do with the fact that there were cars driving around those ramps for however many years, and all of their fumes and carbonation were impacting the steel, or impacting the concrete. It's negligible. It was just an interesting history of the building. That source of carbonation has been removed. You no longer have cars driving through there, so generally it's going to be in a stable condition and there isn't any underlying structural concern. The Dalton Street slabs is a little bit more of a different story. There are cars driving under that. There are going to be cars driving under that. The concrete has had some carbonation from the underside of that, so there's going to need to be some decisions and evaluations of what's going to happen with the structure at the Dalton Street pass. So I think those are the highlights from the concrete. There were a few cracks around the building. I'm always walking around looking for cracks. If you notice, I'll walk by and I'll sort of walk my hand across a crack, seeing, is it moving out of plane? Is it just settlement and stuff? It's always important to track the cracks, but again, we're not seeing anything globally that we see wrong with the concrete. So are there any questions about the slabs or the concrete?
Can you characterize the likelihood of work or the type of work that would likely be required over Dalton Street?
I'm going to confess that I mostly refreshed my memory about the building proper. I would need to refresh my memory a little bit more about Dalton Street and probably take a walk back through there, but I think that we could do that. Yes, Steve?
You talked primarily in the areas of unit masonry where the brick is. Is there anything to be concerned about with the steel behind the stone facade?
Yes. The answer to that would be yes. And potentially even more so, because if you think about how hard it is to find a brick that's going to match the brick out here, I can guarantee it's going to be harder to find a stone that's going to match the stones out here. So that's where, again, you think about the corrosion and what we have going on with the water infiltration, and you think about the materials that are at risk of it. You have the brick that is at risk. Well, yes, it is important and it is significant, and we want it to match. So far, we haven't seen the corrosion getting to the point where it is doing significant damage to the stone. There are cracks, there are some spalls, and there are issues. But again, this goes to the argument of this is the time to do it now, before, instead of looking at a project where you have to take it down, treat it, get appropriate waterproofing in, your next stage of deterioration is going to be you're going to have to replace the stone in addition to taking it down and to addressing it. So there's a very strong argument for completing it in a manner before we start to see that level of deterioration extend in the building. Yes, Steve?
Yesterday on the tour, you pointed out the need at the base of the dome for a tub type of moisture barrier. Can you expound on that, or what we need to include in our estimate?
As that really relates more to the roofing and the waterproofing, I would like to pass that question back to George. But I can tell you from a structural point of view, the intention is we want to make sure that there is a membrane and a surface that is going to prevent any water filtration. I think the most buckets we saw on the tour were right in that area. And if you looked at the plaster damage that was happening there, it's just immense plaster damage. You can just tell that there's water and everything getting in there. So I think that part of it is creating that appropriate waterproofing barrier, and there's probably going to be some challenges to it in that we want to make sure that it has the ability to address how the structure is going to expand and contract, of however we're going to deal with the difference in movement that we're seeing between the wall and between the trusses. So whatever that material or that bathtub is going to end up needing to be, it is going to need to make sure that it's compatible with allowing the building to continue to move the way that it has moved over the last 80 years. Would you like some more definition of the bathtub?
Your question is about the tub at the base of the dome, correct?
Correct.
And that's a half circle, essentially, in plan. I don't know if I was on the roof with you or somebody else. The discussion there was, one of the questions was, are we going to touch the dome? And the answer is, we are not going to touch the dome. And I'm going to underline, bold, emphasize, exclamation point, we're not going to touch the dome. because the dome has performed brilliantly for 70 years. And it's going to perform for another 70 years if we don't touch it. On the other hand, we need to take into consideration two things: what happens at the top and what happens at the bottom of that curve. And at the bottom, we have this thing that will probably move, as Nancy said. And what we need to do is we need to put in a tub that is going to be parapet, that little flat surface, and have a little flashing detail that allows the dome to remain in place, but will capture the water, okay? At the other end, we may want to consider to have a counter-flashing tail, because if you look at the arch of the dome, the way it interfaces with the masonry, the front of the building, it is a continuous curve. It's not a step flashing going into the joints. That will be another area that we need to consider seriously. So the tub at the bottom is going to be covering the parapet with our favorite detail over the parapet, having the tub and go under, and have adequate drainage. One of the issues we're concerned about is whether we have enough pipes to take the water out, because it's a very shallow roof. So it's literally a metal tub. Think of it as a gutter. Don't think of it as a roof. That's really the analogy, okay? It's not a huge area, but it needs to be something that will hold the water, move it out quickly, so the water will not have the opportunity to go through. Okay?
And then repair the plaster damage from underneath or not?
I'm not sure if I want to repair the plaster. I would like to remove areas where the plaster is seriously damaged. I would like to have the plaster as a way of monitoring the condition of the building. It is your best gauge of the performance of the building. In fact, we can do some very simple things: remove the loose plaster and so on, take a series of high-resolution photographs with the cracks, and every year or so we do the same thing, because it will tell us how the building behaves. The message in Nancy's presentation is that the building gives us great signs. And if we look at the signs and we follow the signs, we'll know how the building performs.
So just staying on the dome for 1 second. I've been doing several domes recently, and one of the things I find myself doing is standing in the middle, staring up, looking for the cracks. Found myself in there staring at the cracks over the last 2 days because I can't believe I can't find any. So that speaks to what was the other part of the message, is that you have a good structure. The fact that you have a dome that has lasted this long and has performed this well, and that we're not seeing those signs of distress in the finishes, that is very unique. So, the engineers.
Nancy, what are you going to do on structural steel members where there's been concrete encasement that's spalled off and there's quite a few areas in that? What work is going to be required there?
Well, I think that at the places where we've seen spalling of the concrete, the way that the drape mesh slab works is that the concrete that's around the beam is only contributing to the structural system in that it acts as a haunch in transferring a portion of the loads. So structurally, what's important more is the concrete that's on the sides of the beams. So I think that as long as we want to make sure that we have typically that condition where we have the concrete on the sides of the beams. I didn't see many places where there was loss of concrete on the sides. What we saw a lot was on the bottom, so it was happening, water infiltration getting in, little bit of corrosion just pops that encasement off. However, you have the issue of fire protection. So assuming that this fire protection does need to be maintained, you would need to go back and probably with a cementitious material. I'm seeing more and more from fire protection engineers of not mixing a cementitious fire protection with a spray-on fire protection. So I think that for costing, it's going to be a matter of assuming that you're coming back with a cementitious material on the bottom of those beams for fire protection. Anything else about the concrete or the slabs?
So what's this? I mean, here's the question of timing and fast. So we've got a scope increase due to deterioration. What I'm hearing you say is that you want to clarify this, because I heard you say that the parapet walls, the water and migration through this is probably the biggest risk that's happening, that's changing the fastest, that needs to be addressed. So is that a scope that you could, we know what the solution probably is, we've done this, is that something that you could actually move on much more quickly if the funding is there and the process is there, and how much impact would that have in the scope, in reducing the scope over time? Do you have any way of telling how much that increases? I know that Cole Russell, CRF, they put a scope number of 1.5% per year, because what they calculated the increased scope cost was due to deterioration of building. I guess that's just a calculation of creative. So how do we address that? What's the value of addressing that? Like 12 months sooner than 12 months earlier?
I don't know that 12 months makes the difference in the lifetime of this structure. I think that the areas where 12 months are going to make a difference, they're going to tell us. We're going to see the immediate bulging, like what we're seeing out on that one lintel. I think that there's the strong advantage of doing the work holistically. With these types of repairs, quality control and doing the workmanship on this waterproofing is what matters for the long-term performance of it. Since we're not changing how the system works, getting this waterproofing installed appropriately and consistently is going to be critical to the next 80, 100, however long life of this building. So it's certainly something that, can it be done? The question might be, should it be done? Probably not. Could it be done? Anything can be done. The issue would be, where do you stop? Where do you transition? And each time you create a transition, you create a potential future problem with it. So I think that there is a strong argument of getting in there and basically doing it once. If you think about 80 years of this life, and yes, there's been maintenance issues in this, but they've been minor. There hasn't been any significant major repairs over it. And so if yes, you're going to make the investment now, but if you're going to get another 80, 100 years out of it, of course you have to do some maintenance and maintain any joints that open up, and to deal with that, it's better to get it right and you're going to get a longer life out of it.
How long do buildings like this last compared to like modern construction of what you see for commercial construction? So 1,000 years, 2,000 versus 100, or I mean, how do you have any sense of that?
My sense of that is it's dependent upon your care and your maintenance program. With proper care and maintenance program, a building like this structurally can have an infinite life. As long as you have a foundation that isn't moving, and as long as you keep the water out, and as long as your mechanical engineer isn't cutting it to bits and pieces to put the systems in, there really isn't anything else that's going to cause it to deteriorate. I mean, there are new buildings, there are new fancy buildings with wonderful cavity wall systems that I'm going back and I'm investigating, and those buildings aren't 10 years old with it. We just completed a complete reskinning of I.M. Pei's, the National Gallery of Art. With it, where he had done a new technique of, instead of putting the stones in mortar, they were hung off of the building with brackets and sort of creating this space. All of those anchor failed, and so we had to take the entire skin down and put the entire skin back. That's not what we're facing here. We're facing addressing the areas where there's water that is getting in. So, you know, there's innovation and there's changes in how the facades are doing, and Definitely seen some that have not been so successful. Whereas when you have a brick building that stands there and you keep it properly maintained, they do pretty good. Okay, those are all the things I thought about structurally. And is there any other questions of as far as either scope? Yes. This is the other structural engineering firm.
The localized slab areas that we're talking about down on the ramps and throughout the facility that either need to be possibly replaced or supplemented, do you have a feel for a quantity or a percentage that these guys can start to work into their numbers?
Off the top of my head, I don't have a quantity. I went back through our report and I found a map where we kind of highlight the areas where we're seeing that. And so I think that we could take that and probably by a quick walkthrough, we could give you a number of as far as saying over this area, estimate that you're going to have to replace 20% of the slab or repair about 20% of the slab. So I think we could fairly easily come up with a number for that. But that does remind me of one thing that I didn't talk about, which is these expansion joints that have a lot of water infiltration on, and that I don't believe anybody completely fully understands everything associated with these expansion joints. That's a item that is going to need to be addressed and understood. And I think that it is going to involve some structural modifications, not just dealing with the, George is pointing at Art, I believe. So I think it's going to require some structural modifications, not just coming back with some cover or some other joint. We're going to need to make sure that there's an appropriate joint between the two buildings and understanding how they're moving and provide for that. I covered it. All right. Yes.
Are there any structural concerns associated with the fountain or the structural steel that actually carries the bridge and face the fountain?
I think that it has the similar issues of as far as corrosion with it. If you walk through the fountain, there's obviously a lot of signs of movement and displacement and settlement. There's going to be reconstruction of that fountain and addressing the waterproofing issues. I don't believe that, well, I shouldn't say this, we haven't gone up there enough of as far as if any of the steel is going to require replacement or reinforcing. From the walkthrough we saw yesterday, it's more of a treat it, maintain it, get it back in better condition.
Just to talk about a little bit the history of the fountain and the bridge. The fountain was, actually the whole plaza was removed piece by piece. We identified each piece to put back in place. But what we didn't do is we did not actually take the, I'll call it the bathtub of the fountain itself apart because of the decorative waterfalls that kind of continue on down. And the reason was cost. We just couldn't begin to do that. So we believe that that needs to be taken care of in this work. Because the bathtub itself has many holes in it at the base where it crosses the bridge and becomes the roof of Dalton Street. That whole lower plaza that you see is actually on top of Dalton Street. So that joint is very important to address in this work. There is some carbonation that we've identified in some of that concrete below that, so some of that will be mitigated, but that's also looking at local areas of it. So in general, that's a cost that's important to be understood. We'll be replacing that work. The details are in the 1933 set of documents too.
Anything else structurally? So going back to what I originally said, I've got two messages. I've got a message of where your structure needs attention, and we've got a message of what you do need to do, and you have areas that are showing signs of distress. So I hope for that you remember the image of that corroded lintel that's on display downstairs. Second part of that is remembering what an amazing structure and what a good condition a majority of it is in. And in that, I want you to have the image of when you went up those steps and you went across the dome and you saw those trusses there. I think even for non-structural engineers, even for people who don't care about buildings, that is still a very impressive space. And it is that structure that gives us this amazing space down here. So I hope that I've learned something new about the structure, and of course, I'll be around for any other questions and hopefully some follow-up on looking at a couple areas. Oh, yes.
This isn't why you were part of the team that did part one, but as a structural engineer, I thought I'd ask you the question. Some people in the city have recommended just tearing the building down. As you were talking about all that wonderful structural steel up there, it dawned on me that that's not an easy proposition. Could you talk about what it might cost to tear this building down? Or how you know, what tearing this building down would be like?
It's hard for me to even think about that. But it would definitely be a challenge. I mean, at the end of the day, it's taking down steel and trusses. There'd definitely be logistics. Luckily, you have a large site, so you'd have areas to deal with the structure as you're coming down. From some of the construction photos, if you look at what it took to build these, as far as the centering, the wood that was built under it to get these into place, and then the connections that were installed afterwards. So it would definitely be an undertaking. I couldn't really speak to the costs.
No, but I mean, it's not like, for example, when I've seen buildings taken down, they're demolished, they're exploded, they implode. I know, for somebody who builds things, this is not what you like to hear. Or you might see a wrecking ball. Well, you're not going to take a wrecking ball to that steel. I mean, what are you going to do? Put people up there with welding equipment and they have them cut it apart?
I don't know if one of the CMs might want to speak to that. I would expect that there would be a combination of it. I don't know if the height of it is. I don't know that you would necessarily go with the wonderful implosion of the building. I think it would more be I'm seeing a lot of nodding from Turner in the back row. I think it would more be a piece-by-piece dismantlization of it.
Well, I think we'll get to this discussion more when we talk about relocation, because that would be part of the equation, but I just wanted your professional opinion. Thank you.
And so that's my professional opinion. And my personal opinion, coming from, I've been in New York for about the last 8 or 10 years, and I do a lot of time traveling in and out of Grand Central Station and Penn Station. And I assume everybody's very well aware of the loss of the original Penn Station in New York. It was demolished to make way for Madison Square Garden. And I can tell you it is not a fun place to travel through. Much more enjoy going through Grand Central and the beautiful train station. And that structure was lost. And they put in Madison Square Garden, which was going to be the most wonderful, fabulous new construction defining a new era. What are we talking about now? Demolishing Madison Square Garden because it's not functioning well, it's not functioning as a train station, and they're looking to move a new train station into the old post office. So there are the lessons of once it's gone, and you just can't recapture it. And new has advantages, but sometimes it's not as good as the performance of the old.
If I may, if you recall the image we looked at yesterday of the construction of the Union Terminal, and as Nancy indicated, this place was built by people who built railroads. And you have a series of bridges and trusses that make up the building. You're not going to say, I'm going to implode it, because it cannot be imploded. You're not going to say, I'm going to bring in the wrecking ball. It is going to be dismantled, and it's going to be taken down apart, sections by section. It's going to take time, and it's going to take money. I cannot estimate the cost. Somebody who does that for a living can do it, but it's not going to be a fun and easy thing to do, because essentially we're going to be taking a battleship apart. It is not something very simple. If you look at the trusses that make up the dome, it is something that is going to require a significant amount of effort, cranes and so on and so forth to do it. We've seen buildings in major cities that have been taken apart, and it is something that takes quite a bit of time.
And we didn't mention the asbestos in the dome.
Maybe just to hit on the asbestos issue in the dome, for those of you that weren't part of the tour yesterday, the asbestos is in place in that dome, and it's fine in its current condition being in place, but if the building is demolished, then there has to be mitigation measures put in place to mitigate the dust and the particles that will be in the air from the demolition. So it's an expensive endeavor to do such a thing. So now we're going to, unless there's any other questions, we're going to move on to, well, I guess we're running a little bit early, so maybe we skip over the, well, no, we have to move on to the utilities. So we're going to discuss the utilities now for the building.
I would like to suggest a slight modification. Yesterday, if you recall, during the discussion, we agreed that some of us need to go and take a look at the area that is in danger, the risk area. I would propose that if we can take an early lunch break and we regroup right after lunch and we'll continue with the agenda.
That sounds good. Just so everyone knows, what we discussed yesterday was Nancy from Silman and THP, who's the structural engineer that's doing the valuation for this. We're going to walk the building together and identify areas outside of what was originally identified in the master plan of areas that need to be addressed through the restoration, and also immediately if there's structural conditions that are a danger to the current use of the building.
So what time will lunch be ready, Doug? Noon? What time will lunch be ready? Noon? Roughly? I just want to be cognizant of the time of the task force members too.
Well, you know, maybe something that we could go into as, and this doesn't, and what we just discussed can still occur. Maybe we could start diving into some of the questions that were brought up by the construction managers. We sent out a list of recommendations of how to address certain questions that were brought up to kind of implement in your cost estimates. Maybe we could discuss those to make sure they're fully clarified for you for preparation of the cost estimate. Does that make sense, George? Okay.
Yeah.
When these questions were put in front of you, understand that these are not decisions that were made. These are criteria that we came up with to evaluate the cost of the overall project. So none of these questions and answers that were put on paper, these aren't the answers that we've determined are the right. These are just what we want them to utilize to come up with their cost estimate. So it's always something open to conversation, open to adjustment as we go through these.
Scott, Doug said lunch will be ready in 2 minutes. So do you want to work on the questions and answers over lunch?
Yeah, why don't we just
let people get their lunch, give them a chance to read the questions and answers, and then discuss it?
Yes, and then we can go through it as part of the working lunch.
Great.
Will new seismic code requirements cause for any existing structural modifications? The answer to that is no. The existing site required considerable engineering fill for the building construction, and the historical documents describe the use of wood piles in the fill. After 80 plus years, is this fill still considered fill in terms of seismic design considerations? So I think Nancy addressed the wood piles and how we should deal with that versus the slab on this particular project. For the time being, I would assume that it's in good structural condition. I do agree with Nancy that a geotechnical report should be considered to further look at the condition of the piles if it's decided to move forward. Can concrete encasement, steel protection be done in another way than concrete replacement? We'll have to confirm that with the structural engineers when they return.
I think she referenced that. Yeah. She said we should use cementitious and not spray ply.
Okay. Request the design team walk through the floor plan floor by floor to discuss the scope of each space and the intended extent of work as currently anticipated. We often categorize the spaces as light, medium, heavy renovation, and define a definition of these. In considering historic space, preservation zone 1 and 2 in the master plan versus non-historic preservation 3 in master plan, the spaces below the concourse level are non-historic, while historic spaces are found on the concourse level and higher. The extent of the work should be based on assumptions from the master plan. What are the acoustical requirements, modifications in the rotunda as well as other spaces? Several strategies, options for the various spaces are presented in the master plan. The assumptions for the acoustical treatment in the rotunda will be confirmed. So, I guess that's a question for Doug. Should we include the acoustical requirements in the cost estimate for Monday, for the rotunda? So the question is okay, so we'll include them as a separate line item, the acoustical improvements to the rotunda.
The reason I believe that is if we have an acoustically sound rotunda, we can bring in more groups and earn more revenue and give a better experience. So I'd like to have that as a line item that we can either leave in or take out depending upon the cost.
We will give you 5 bullets and you will create the allowance. How about that? Okay.
Is the rotunda to be painted? Yes. The rotunda is to be painted. The rotunda will also need smoke evacuation, sidewall 30 feet throw sprinklers, smoke beam detectors, new lighting, and acoustical treatment devices. Will the boiler stack be removed? Yes, make that assumption. Are the 3 historic restrooms considered for ADA compliance? No, they are not considered in the code required restroom count. This building is on the National Register of Historic Places. Will the APT AIC New Orleans chapter allow for relaxed requirements on the building envelope restoration, such as window replacements versus restoration? The assumption is that windows will be replaced as was done on Project 1. Mechanical. Is the basis of the estimate to be a one-for-one replacement for the existing equipment. No, assume a comprehensive replacement for the HVAC with 21st century heating, ventilation, and air conditioning with proper controls, energy efficiency features, humidification where it is needed, etc. How much additional capacity should be added for future needs? This is addressed in the master plan. How much redundancy needs to be added? The Museum Center will confirm what is required as part of the operating requirements, accreditation, and exhibit hosting capabilities. Doug? Doug, the question is how much redundancy needs to be added? And the answer was the Museum Center will confirm what is required as part of the operating requirements, accreditation, and exhibit spacing capabilities. Right.
I mean, I don't think this is anything that's any different than what's presently in place. I mean, I don't think we've ever identified there's any like major need. We're not talking about, I mean, we don't like it when the power goes out, but it goes out for about 30 minutes and we survive with it coming back on when it comes back on. So it's an inconvenience, but not one we're willing to pay any money to solve.
Are there any additional humidity control requirements to be put in place above and beyond existed? Yes, refer to the master plan, and if phased, what is HVAC bridging plan to maintain airflow to occupied and critical areas? The construction manager should provide options and costs, and the Museum Center will evaluate the ramifications of phasing. Has geothermal been considered for any new HVAC systems? Would the wells be placed under the parking lots or under the site somewhere else? Yes, it has been considered. Will depend on the costs and benefits of the project. I think for this particular cost estimate, I think we should include it as a separate line item. We should assume that the soil conditions are conducive to geothermal, and that will later need to be determined, but we should make that assumption and assume, but include it as a separate line item. Will incoming electrical service need to be upgraded? No. Verify all existing electrical equipment to be replaced. I think the electrical equipment to be replaced, I think we should follow the master plan. George, is there anything additional that needs to be considered outside the master plan for the electrical?
For the electrical, I think we need to consider a wholesale replacement of the switchgear in the basement coming on up through the main distribution panels. Master plan identifies a number of locations that are at their peak capacity as far as on the risers and things. So as far as the distribution and things, I think we need to have a cost in to replace all the panels and bring them up to code. Some have been replaced, but not identified individually on the plan. Does that answer the question?
So next question, discuss special lighting needs for current and future exhibit space. We kind of addressed that earlier. And another one of the questions, is there any further clarification needed? Is complete teledata and AV systems to be included in the estimate, including wiring and equipment? We discussed that earlier during the presentation for the electrical about the AV requirements. Will any new electrical wiring be allowed to be surface mounted in raceways, or will everything be required to be concealed? This will vary by the area. In the preservation zones, there will be no apparent wiring, mechanical, etc. Is replacement of the generator required? Yes. Are there any other questions that we want to go through now?
Just one quick, it was
Tom, can you hand that mic back to them? I'm sorry.
There was just some conversation yesterday about creating 3 runs of catwalk around the rotunda up in the interstitial space above the dome, and just wanted to verify that we should include that, because I don't think we had previously. Just wanted to verify if that's what's needed up in that space.
Yes, that should be included in the cost estimate.
Scott, I wanted to see also if the task force members had any questions or comments, because these assumptions tend to pertain to scope as well. Just wanted to see if there are any questions or comments that any of y'all have. Yeah, go ahead, Keith.
I had one, just wanted to revisit on redundancy, because I've seen a lot of information over the last couple of days, and I probably just mistakenly recall some reference to a second water tower. I think that would certainly be extreme, but would that fall under classification of redundancy, and they would only utilize one? And I'd ask the same question about the generator in terms of handling load beyond what would be considered life safety, and whether or not the areas of the exhibits that are required to maintain humidity and temperature at a very finite level would fall under potentially generator control.
On the first, excuse me, on the first question, are you referring to on the first question, you're referring to the cooling tower redundancy? Is that the water towers that you're referring to? Okay. The existing cooling towers lack redundancy, and the system is completely at the mercy of whether they operate or not. Putting redundancy in the event of a motive burnout is highly important. The thing with the cooling towers, you don't need 100% redundancy, but maybe 50% redundancy. By the way, the cooling towers are divided into separate cells. If you have a 2-cell requirement, for example, but you have 3 cells, then you have 1 cell always available if another goes down or needs maintenance. The moment they have 2 cells, they need 2 cells, and if one goes down, they are in trouble. So moving forward, a larger tower is required with redundancy at least on 50%. Your second question was as to whether any of the air handling units need to be on emergency power, and I believe that this is a question that comes down to the facilities managers as to, Doug said power goes out for 30 minutes at a time. There's pretty reliable power source in from two major feeders off the city, and if they have certain collections areas that can't be down for 30 minutes, then those units would have to be on emergency power as well. Good.
Any other questions? Okay, we're going to revise those questions and answers and repost them on our SharePoint site just based off our conversation that we had now. Now, let's move on to the utilities for the building.
Regarding utilities, the only issue I think that needs some clarification would be drainage. And I would like Art to talk about that. Drainage.
Storm drainage and sewer lines, we anticipate to keep separate. We feed into a combined system. We know the region is going through some changes in that regard here in the city, and any future connections to separate systems we want to be prepared to do. So that's how we've kind of applied our work with Project One. So in general, that's the drainage issue. As far as site detention, the answer in question was in actually that list where we've resolved that we're actually not changing. We had the worst condition with the parking lot. If anything, it'll get better if we do anything. So as far as added capacity, there is none. And that's how we kind of state our case. So we should have no problem. Any other issues? We talked about electrical, we talked about some of the other utilities, but
regarding other utilities that might involve with cost estimates such as gas service, electric service, and water service, those are all in adequately sized for the building. They're all in good working condition, and changes to those don't really need to be a part of the cost estimating.
So I think we pretty well already defined the site through our other conversations that we have just discussed in terms of what's included and what's not included, and also going through the questions and answers. Is there any question about what is included in the site and what's not based off our conversations? Maybe we could bring up an aerial of the site and just...
This diagram that you see here actually describes roughly the building today. Here are the edges of the building. This is Dalton Street, and the deck here is the fountain we talked about. This is part of the arrival and the approach to the building. The flags are in these locations here. You can see the shadow of the big one. These two drives were just repaved. The parking lots under this pricing exercise will remain as parking lots, and there will be some repairs along the edges of these two retaining walls. That is basically the scope for the site. Any questions?
So I think we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back, and we're really going to start diving into the assumptions, and then talk about with Messer and Turner about what should be included in this cost estimate, and really dive into all the details of the deliverable in terms of the cost estimate we're going to be putting together. So now we're hoping that the design team, the construction managers, and the evaluation team can all meet to kind of go through the assumptions, come up with a consensus on next steps and the deliverables for the assignments for everyone so that we can all move forward with the cost estimate we're preparing. So let's all head to the dining room so we can sit around some round tables to go through this together. It might be more conducive to open conversation between the groups.